What is this Wong car? Why?
Now, here we're going. Okay. I think we are going. Do your bit again.
We at war. Ooh, we at war with anthropomorphism, exoticism, racism, and most of all, we at war with ourselves.
The anthropomorphism bit threw me because I figured out you were referring to the red panda furry transformation in Turning Red, which we're going to be covering. But, like, every time I've thought about anthropomorphism recently, it's not in the context of, like, anthro, it's in the context of, like, eco-poetics and shit. Like,
What poetics?
eco-poetics, yeah.
Wait, like, as in, like, Nico Arc, the
No,
Nico
eco-poetics. Wait, what? What the fuck would Nico-poetics be? Holy shit, that's a whole...
Oh, you're saying eco-poetics.
Yes.
Oh, shit, my bad. Yo,
now
my
I have to
brain
figure out what
like...
Nico-poetics would be, because that could be a really good bit.
Man, sorry, like, yeah, I feel like I just got furry brained, you know, after watching Turning Red, because I was talking to Cuteness Unit actually a little bit ago, and I heard their thing where they were like, yeah, I think Turning Red is like an attack on the Chinese, and I'm just like, yeah, you're right, it is an attack on the Chinese, but actually their plan failed. Now I'm a furry.
I mean, it's really mid-furry. Like, it's... I mean, she just turns into a stuffed animal, basically. Like, it doesn't look like a real animal, and it doesn't look like a furry. It just looks like one of the big sort of, like, Asian plushy mascot things that she has, like, a bunch of stuff, like, yeah, exactly, like the real Akuma and stuff she has in her room.
Yeah, seriously. You know what she turned into? She turned into neoliberal semio-capitalism.
She turned into a line sticker.
Oh, what sticker?
Line sticker. You know, Line,
shit.
The Japanese mess. Yeah.
Bruh, is Line gonna take over Disney? Is that what's gonna happen?
That would be cool,
Disney...
actually. Like, again, I've always, like, Facebook was trying to integrate stickers into Messenger a few years ago.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
it
They
feels
had the cat.
Yeah, it felt like they were trying to do the Line thing, and it never caught on in the West. And, like, I can see why, because I just simply never have... I do not have the memory to, like, go through to sort of, like, pick out a sticker out of their enormous sticker banks on, like, the spur of the moment to reply to a message. I feel like the reason Line stickers work on Line and on, like, Asian messaging apps is because you guys are used to memorizing, like, ideographic alphabets, like, just memorizing huge banks of symbols.
Man, that feel when, what's it called? When the character for to see is like a shellfish. At least that's what they say in Remember the Kanji.
Yeah.
But
although Facebook,
actually,
like, Japanese emoji took over here, and I think that's why Facebook thought the sticker model could work. Yeah?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, when they got like the katakana for she to look like a face, like one of the Lenny face, not Lenny faces, but like one of the emoticon faces. No, yeah, I was gonna say randomly, there was some H I was reading, and I like way back in the day, and I just remembered there was a thing where it's like, I remember your first name. It was. It's Fuda. Wait, you remember my first name? It's like, yeah, it's the same for Red Panda. And I just concluded to me, wait, Red Panda? Fuda? Disney? What does this mean?
Wait, what? Okay. You'll have to explain to me the pun or whatever this is running on, because this could be very important. There's a lot of, like, sus things that could be going on in this movie. I feel bad saying, like, bunch of, like, sus stuff about it, because actually Liz watched it recently, and Liz really liked it. I did not dislike it. It was, like, it was a decent kids movie. It was, like, the thing that struck me about it is just kind of how over-determined it was, but, like, I feel like we should actually start, because this is supposed to be about literature, and we should start off by framing the episode, like the general concept, and not just going into Turning Red.
Yeah. Yeah, we gotta warm ourselves up before we're turning red.
Yeah. Actually, also, I gotta post the stream link now that it seems to be working. Let me go do that.
Right.
Okay, I still don't see the regular... Let me go on the channel. Is it working normally now? Yep, it is. Okay.
Oh, here it is. The thing from the H was, what's it called? Yeah, so she gets mad because the guy doesn't remember her name, and she's like, she says her name is Miori, and she calls him by his first name, which is Futa, and then, and he's like, you remember my name? And she says, it's easy. It's the same as Red Pandas.
Oh, wait, so is this like Futa with like a double U or something? It's like Futa, like F-U-U. Well, like, okay. It's not like Futa like Futanari, because that would be really...
Yeah, it's not Futanari, but it sounds similar, so... What is Disney? What does this mean? Pixar, what does this mean?
I mean, that's somebody in a doujin having a red panda related name. Like that's not. That's just you being a Coomer, frankly.
Man, I'm so peeved. It's all good though, because like when we cover the thing after Turning Red, trust me, like we're gonna see lots of Cooming and
oh yeah. Okay. But yeah, let's, why are we talking about any of these things?
Yeah, well...
I mean, to be fair, Turning Red is part of why we were talking about these things, because I wanted an excuse to watch that movie, because there was a bunch of fucking discourse about it. But, like, you also talk about and sort of complain about, like, as an Asian-Canadian diaspora writer, like, it's a thing that comes up in our conversations a lot, like, the way you feel sort of expected to write, and the way you feel like the sort of context you sort of feel compelled to rebel against. Can you try and just explain that in general terms, and then we can get into specifics?
Sure thing. So the book in question is called "You Are Eating an Orange, You Are Naked" by Sheung.
That's the last book that this came up in relation to. I also read Wayson Choi's Jade, Peony, but it's a broader phenomenon, or there's sort of both. You know, we should have read Crazy Rich Asians.
I mean, maybe, but then again, I mean, that's just kind of like it's wearing the Asian kind of thing, like superficially. Like it seems like it's nothing more than just what it is.
Mm.
But just that coincidentally, it's it's Asian. Like then again, this is gonna turn into that argument where it's like, oh, what if they were a different race? It wouldn't be much different. Well, I mean, I wouldn't really know. And at this point, it doesn't really matter that much.
That's the thing. Crazy Rich Asians seems like it intrigues me because it is one of the few sort of popular airport novels of the last recent whatever that also feels like it tries to be a social novel, that tries to be about the socioeconomic real world.
Right.
And I mean, there's apart from the ones that are just fan service for a given political for a political ideology, like Louise Penny doing that book with Hillary Clinton or whatever. But and it's also one that acknowledges China in particular as a modern and modernizing country, because one of the things I recall you talking about a lot is that when stuff sort of focalizes Asianness in diaspora literature, it's almost always looked at in terms of sort of the archaic and, like, the sort of
yes.
old traditions.
And
The what?
Amy Tan, yeah, the poster child for pretty much that problem where essentially the Chinese are just kind of basically I remember reading about how Amy Tan was kind of like one of the Asian American writers responsible for kind of the image of the Chinese in literature, for a writer who's kind of shedding a light on the history of Asians in America. It oddly reinforces some heavy stereotypes, like to the point that you just have some random oh yeah, I know everything there is to know about Asian people because of Amy Tan, and usually whenever Amy Tan has a story, usually if you're an Asian male in the story, you're basically fucked because you're just shown in the worst light possible. I was told from one of my boys who read Kitchen God's Wife that basically the Asian man in it is essentially just a big a huge brute in a sense, that just doesn't understand how to live in, I guess, America, which is funnily enough, if you think of someone say Virginia Tech shooter Seung-Hui Cho is almost not even an embodiment of such, but it's kind of a mutation of such a portrayal, because one of the biggest things about Seung-Hui Cho that not really that shocked people per se, but made his case, I guess, kind of unique is the fact that language has been a huge complication for him, in the sense that he was always that people have always said that he never spoke a word, really. Even after the shooting itself, the pastor of the church he went to said, "I've never heard Seung-Hui Cho say a single word, a single sentence, until he was reading his manifesto." And so having that kind of image sort of shroud I guess Asian, even Asian males, partially due to Amy Tan. Actually, I think funnily enough, it wasn't even Amy Tan that kind of sort of blipped my head on this. Actually, the thing that made me realize the kind of really archaic portrayal of Chinese people was literally I was playing a game called True Crime Streets of LA, which is basically just pretty much a open world crime game where you're essentially just trying to find something about some counterfeit money or whatever, and so and you fight triads in the game. But the thing with the triads is they're all portrayed with these Mao 1930s Cultural Revolution looking
Cultural Revolution is way later than that, but yeah.
Yeah, probably getting the dates wrong, but you know what I mean, right?
The pagan Dragon Ball.
There's some Dragon Ball shit. They would actually, the funniest part about the whole thing is that literally when you reach the Triad boss is literally this supernatural cadaver who has hidden tunneled under Chinatown. Of course, his restaurant is this big pagoda tower, and you go underneath it, zombies, dragons, and concubines.
What game was this again?
True Crime Streets of LA. It literally takes a left turn from the fact that, and it's funny too. Actually, the more interesting thing is that when we think about film, I know I talk about Johnny To a lot, and I even whenever we're watching movies, they're let's watch a Johnny To movie. But the thing is that at least stateside, the thing about Hong Kong action is that Hong Kong action was always defined either by either martial arts or just really over the top, John Woo diving with double guns. That's cool and all, I guess. But at the same time, it really defined almost what the market that those movies would be pigeonholed into. And True Crime Streets of LA kind of like that too, because its influence is Hong Kong action. The main character is half Russian, half Chinese, which is kind of cool, I guess. But yeah, but the entire plot of it and the way that it shows off L.A. is almost in the perspective of like this particular kind of early 2000s Hollywood action movie. Actually, what's also extremely not even disturbing, but just super funny about it is that you have this game about LA, you have this game about crime, and the soundtrack has a lot of like West Coast rap, like it's got it. But Compton and South Central are not even in the game.
Huh.
Yeah, like pretty much like that entire area is just inaccessible. Technically it's accessible by glitching the game, but yeah, it's not there. Like the only people that you see, you see black people on the street, but they're mostly just civilians. But no, yeah, like pretty much Hollywood essentially is just Hollywood Hills, maybe downtown, and then the lower half is just like literally nothing.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like there's different sorts of like cultural stereotypes of Asian people, Asian culture in sort of Western contexts, and there's like movies and video games have like one set, and then like literature has another. And in literature, there's kind of been the contemporary sort of diversity discourse for longer, like because it's a less centralized sort of industry, so it's not so much like in Hollywood, you only really had like a lot of minorities breaking into these like incredibly capitalized directorial and acting and screenwriting roles in like the last few years. And in literature, there's just been people writing books, and for the last couple of decades, there's been this sort of like market for Asian American and Asian Canadian diaspora fiction that's sort of evolved around people like Amy Tan and Wayson Choi, but like that is also kind of defined by, on a certain level, what publishers think would be appealing to a broad, largely white audience. And it feels like with stuff like Turning Red, like now that you have like this sort of woke move and towards like deliberate representation as opposed to just like capitalizing on like, oh, kung fu is cool or whatever in Hollywood, you have like with things like Shang-Chi and Turning Red, there seems to be kind of in some ways coming closer to the sort of literary set of tropes. Like I feel like, yeah, Turning Red and Jade, Peony kind of have a lot in common structurally, iconographically. Although Turning Red is absolutely far more of just like an apologia for the West, actually, on a level of like naked propaganda that I outright was not expecting.
It's like, hey, we're not Asian parents, but we have boy bands, okay? Like, at least we can all agree we like boy bands, right? Including the dad, the dad who's just like, I mean, like, he like, the dad character, like, he means well, but he's just extremely insufferable because, like, the movie just treats him as just like an accessory. Just,
well,
like,
he's like the nice dad of, like, sort of contemporary pop culture. I feel like there's this new sort of like nice dad, like soft nice dad archetype emerging out of sort of like the, like, we're moving beyond the like Homer Simpson, Peter Griffin dopey dad that's like kind of a problematic archetype because it's like letting shitty men get away with being shitty men, so we have to have this like ultra wholesome father figure, like the sort of Greg Universe model, and he's sort of like an Asian Greg Universe, but because he lives in this sort of like quasi-matriarchal, ultra-traditional family, he can't be there for his kid in the way Greg Universe does, but he tries.
Yeah, Yeah, well, I mean, I can at least like I'm at least a bit more sympathetic to like nicer Asian dad, considering that like there's a like while like there is a Reddit for Reddit / Asian parent stories, I also feel like that that kind of idea has sort of become, how would you say, like sort of intertwined with writing about Asian trauma because like yeah, like that experience is like is prescient, but I worry that it's being it's sort of being shown in almost like an exploitative way. I'll get into more of it a bit later too.
When we actually do Turning Red, but I think you wanted to go on about Sheung first, because that's like most of what we've been talking about is sort of writing of an older generation. Like Wayson Choi, who I read, wrote about a generation or two before himself even, so some of the sort of archaism is just unavoidable, because he's writing about, like, before China was even communist, like, but, and Amy Tan is sort of like, I'm not sure what generation her stuff is mostly dealing with, but still a generation before, like, now, before Neo-China arrived from the future, and before, like, there was a really sizable second or third generation Asian population in North America. So you have, like, younger Asian writers trying to figure out where to fit in that. And Turning Red is kind of an interesting example, in fact, because it has this, like, bizarre... It seems to be... I don't know, like, the generational status of the writer, but it is, like, it's not clear what generation immigrant May is, but also she lives in this fucking traditional temple in the middle of downtown Toronto that just sort of, like...
Yeah, which is really impossible, by the way, damn, like, the only time you're gonna see some place like that is, like, maybe some decorations off the buildings off of Chinatown, but a temple that big in Chinatown, like, even if they had a Chinatown, like, I don't know if it would have happened.
But I think Sheung was, like, Sheung is someone you picked up because you were sort of interested in his work, like, when you had first heard about it, and it seems to be doing something closer to what you're trying to do, which is, like, a millennial Asian perspective informed by, like, the sort of culture of Wong Kar-wai and Hong Kong cinema and sort of, like, urban dreamscapes and whatever. But you then, like, read 10 pages into it and called me at the bar because you were so frustrated with it. Yeah, tell me more about that and, like, how it...
angry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well. Well, I'll start with, like, a small preface and then I'll get into it. But basically, the main thing that I guess that I hope to I guess explore during this podcast and also in general is the idea of how does one write about a racialized perspective in the modern world, especially with the idea of myths taking on an entirely different connotation. Because the thing is that in my experience from reading some like Asian diaspora literature, I won't name any names at all, but I will say that there is a huge trend where they would immediately reference like ancient Chinese poetry, ancient like Chinese history, which I get to an extent because it's like it's about like the culture, I guess. But at the same time, it's like, why is it that this contemporary perspective of like of say, for example, Asians have to constantly, like, almost reflexively have to constantly reference like old Chinese poetry. Like Chinese poetry has a rich history. Don't get me wrong, but it's almost like the reference seems almost to the point of not even cliche, more to the point of annoyance. Like,
I mean, it's kind of funny because, like, I'm hearing this and thinking, I mean, well, ancient Chinese poetry is fucking lit, and I'm like a white writer who would not mind if contemporary Western writers were more engaged with their own literary canon. Or for that matter, non-Western literary canon. So it's, like, kind of cool that there is, like, a level of engagement with the literary canon, like, but...
Yeah, I mean, if they engage with it, like, in a structural way while entering the modern era, that'd be cool. I mean, one example I can think of, at the very least, is one of is Fan Wu's translation. I believe the book itself is called Hoarfrost and Solace. At least that one, despite referencing, like, an old Chinese poet, at least, like, it actually tries to modernize the text in some way. Even Stanford was really interested in the Misty poets, who pretty much wrote, like, contemporary Chinese poetry, and it's fucking awesome.
Yeah, the Misty poets are so cool, actually. I read a bunch of them. I took a contemporary Chinese lit course in undergrad, and got really into the Misty poets. Need to go back and read them more. Like, yeah, it would be cool if more people engaged with contemporary Chinese literature in the sort of diaspora.
Yeah, because the thing is that Chinese poetry, Chinese poetry and Chinese literary tradition is still ongoing in the fact that a lot of it really does speak to a lot of modern conditions, like the Foxconn poets who killed themselves, spoke to the kind of hyper-industrialization that the East had gone through after World War II, and even continuing now, being exploited by multinational companies. That's basically like one of the ground zeros of hyper-modernity. And that's how far the Chinese poetry tradition is truly able to go. But just that, whenever it's referenced in Chinese diaspora, it's more like, have you heard of the poet Duo? Have you heard of the poet can you throw me another name?
My friend Francis was just showing me a bunch of Chinese poets, and I'm blanking on all their names now, like ancient ones. Yeah.
Have you heard of the filmmaker Wong Kar-wai? Have you heard of the hit game Among Us?
I don't mean to be an epic Maoist. I don't actually even like Maoism that much, but it would be cool if if somebody referenced Chairman Mao's poetry. One thing I did during that course when I was in undergrad was I went nuts because our readings entirely skip we have stuff from sort of before the revolution and stuff from the sort of Dengist liberalizing era, but we entirely skip the Maoist cultural revolution era, and the prof is just no literature worth remembering was written during this period. I'm like, that can't be right. I'm sure there was social realism, and I spent literally an entire night in the library trying to find anything I could on Chinese literature of the revolutionary period, and I was able to find stuff about it. They had their own sort of socialist realist tradition, and there was some interesting scholarship on it, and but none of it is translated, and it honestly felt like a sort of an anti-communist cover-up that nobody is willing to even attempt to translate revolutionary era Chinese literature, and for that matter, there doesn't even seem to be a lot of interest in it in China.
Yeah, because I remember listening to one of the Humanist Unit episodes. Stacy, she was saying how there was this annihilating feeling when she went to China, and what's interesting is that I'm sure you've heard me mention this to you verbatim, Chinese modern history, at least from 20th century onward, is filled with this kind of not even precarious, but straight up annihilation, in the sense of the fact that the country had to had gone through like several revolutions, several industrial periods before getting basically fucked during World War II by the Japanese, and then having to rapidly industrialize during the years after World War II. Also with a little help from the U.S. and that constant industrialization, even going further down into the 2000s, like that kind of like. That kind of annihilation feels like kind of like a spirit within like China's history, and perhaps like its ghost is still lingers.
So that seems to be one of the things that I find, I guess, kind of weird with Diaspora stuff, where like there's very little, like, I think one of the things you might be identifying in the sort of the structure of your Amy Tan turning red kind of diaspora literature is there's this weird sense in which as soon as you cross the ocean and get to America, like China or Japan or Thailand or wherever it is that your diaspora from gets sort of like frozen in time and becomes this kind of like memory opposed to the like modern present reality of America, but there seems to be little engagement with the changing reality of the old country. But in your own experience, like your like actual family, from the sense I get, like is very engaged with like their relatives in Hong Kong and like away like with news from both Hong Kong and the mainland, and seems to be as plugged into that modernity as Canadian modernity.
Actually, now that you mentioned that too, actually there are a couple things I want to bring up. I remember there was a seminar I attended with one of my boys. They were talking about Japanese history in terms of what was the guy's name? Roland Barthes, his thing on Empire and the Signs, basically saying how unlike in Western traditions, like let's say if we'll use the example of a dinner table, right? In a Western setting dinner table, like you have a singular plate that acts like the center, whereas in like in Barthes' case, I guess, like the there is no center in the fact that there's like plates of stuff in the middle, but there's no like center within the center of the table, so to speak. But essentially, the history for the Japanese, at least, was that they wanted to integrate a lot, like at least like Japanese Americans at the time were trying to integrate a lot faster, also with the help of Christian missionaries. Because it was in maybe not direct reaction, but sort of. But at the time, the Chinese weren't integrating like with American life like as quickly, in the sense that like even by the 80s, right? Like movies like, for example, Die Hard have pretty much kind of accepted that Japanese businessmen are like a thing in terms of the business world, whereas like the Chinese aren't considered in the same in the same light. They're more considered as almost like these kind of basically immigrants who can't basically live properly in America, or in like America, or live like the American lifestyle, or are just like reacting against it. Which also mentioning too, like Berardi, when he talks about nostalgia, or sort of like reactionary nostalgia, where he talks about how cultural memory, like his thing, sort of in reaction to certain atrocity perpetrators and shooters who are kind of committing their acts in the name of a certain cultural ideal, like for example Breivik, who was acting for quote unquote Christian Europe. Berardi says that nostalgia and culture like are not like static images. They're constantly reproducing kind of performances, like for lack of a better word. They're these constantly regenerating kind of ideas. And the thing is that what's funny then is that for a lot of Asian diaspora literature, it's almost like it's holding on to this kind of, not even nostalgia. Like, part of it is nostalgia, but also just like holding on to this idea of what the culture is or what the culture represents. When even then, like, the culture that the image they're holding on to doesn't even, not even that it doesn't exist anymore, but it's like it's a lot. It's not even. It's not even.
Well, like yeah, and the thing that
more invisible. Like, it's like the idea where it's like this isn't about sheer speed anymore. It's something more fundamental than that. That 86 is unreal. Anyway, yeah, that's just
Well, the interesting thing there is I feel like somebody like Logo, who I was talking about Sino-futurism in Rosicrucian Space Force with a couple weeks ago, would say that, like, the sort of contemporary Chinese state, and I think this is true whether you like it or not, I don't particularly like it, is like simultaneously like has like a sort of simultaneous grounding in tradition and orientation towards the future in a way that doesn't even seem to be possible in the West, where like Xi Jinping like definitely knows all the Chinese classics and also knows a lot of the Western classics and is trying to like implement Confucian values into his vision of society, but is also like bent on modernizing the country extremely rapidly and developing technologies, energy technologies, digital technologies, AI, all this stuff that's going to radically transform society at a much faster rate than Western states and governments are, and there's a continuity like from the past to the future through the present in a way, rather than a sort of split between the past and the future in the present. But the diaspora stuff, a lot of it seems to, I think, sort of hyper reify the split between the past and the present or future through the split between cultures. And I'm aware this is essentially, at least the correct, like, intersectional answer would be this is essentially my fault as a white person. This is like, this is what being a racialized minority does to your conception of your own history. But it's also something you seem to be frustrated with on some level. But yeah, what about Sheung King? Because you'd think from what he's doing that he might have, like, some sort of alternative to this vision as like an extremely millennial Asian writer. He's definitely extremely... Also, I need to go to the bathroom for a second, so let me just pause. But then we can resume on Sheung King.
Fair enough. All right. In that case, I'll just quickly grab a couple quotes from Wong Kar-wai, but let's see. But no, yeah, for everyone still listening out there, I guess I'll give my quick cliff notes. Essentially, so one thing that's become more prevalent between not even just diaspora writers, but just writers in general in the contemporary era is the idea of liminality. Liminality meaning being between spaces. It's become prevalent because even now we're sort of in a world where we're between catastrophes, between the wired and the real, between the old country and the country that we're in. And so Sheung King's novel, You're Eating an Orange, You Are Naked, kind of tackles that, and it tackles it in a way that's similar to, has a huge influence on Wong Kar-wai's books. Now, for anyone who's not a huge film person, which, I don't blame you, because the thing is that Wong Kar-wai has a ridiculous, following to the point of being fetishistic, like to the point that if you're like a film major, you'll see people going like, oh, well, first they'll cough, and go like, In the Mood for Love, have you seen that movie? Oh, it's so Kino. Oh my gosh, it's so Kino. Is that a new card? Yeah, you'll get those people. And so, what's interesting about Wong Kar-wai is that he does create some really visually outstanding movies. I mean, he's kind of part of what put Hong Kong cinema on the map for all this, for not even just cinephiles, but just in general. And so, and in a sense, there's a kind of literary beauty to Wong Kar-wai's works, not even due to the visuals, but even down to the writing too, which really captures the emotional textures of the characters, whether it's Cop 223 from Chungking Express, or the Hitman from Fallen Angels, or even just Leslie Cheung from Happy Together, which is the best movie, by the way. And so with Sheung King's book, having to tackle it in this in this kind of mode is interesting, because it invites not just the literary side, but also the visual side of literature, which has become very contemporary. Having to make this abstract medium visceral, to have weight, to have heft, to be concrete, in the same way that for example, Wong Kar-wai's films are able to capture the interiority of the characters, not just from just their monologues, but just their but also just the visual journey between districts, between shots, is commendable. Although I'll get into my complaints when baroquespiral comes back.
I'm back, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, good timing, because I was just giving a bit of a primer about who Wong Kar-wai is and who Sheung King, the kind of thing that makes Sheung King's book interesting, I guess, from the premise about liminal spaces, because liminal spaces, other than just the meme, is quite prevalent now, because we're in between catastrophes, we're in between the real and the wired, we're in between the old country and the new country, so, and that's a pretty important kind of psychosphere to tackle, and also in case of, along with Wong Kar-wai's kind of influence, be it Wong Kar-wai being not just a great filmmaker, but also being able to inspire a literary quality to not even just the way that the film moves, but also just the way it's written too. It's almost written like a novel, which is understandable, because his works are kind of based off of a Hong Kong writer named Liu Yichang, whose translation, by the way, is so fucking expensive, $40. Damn.
I wonder if it's on LibGen, but I'll check. Yeah. I kind of doubt it.
It wasn't last I checked, but okay. Yeah, LibGen boys, where are you at? You may be able to access it because you're in a university.
Oh, that's a good point, actually.
Yeah, so cop one for me, okay?
Yeah.
This is the true Chinese way. Fucking pirate that shit. Put it on a disc and sell it outside some tried controlled territories. Obviously, this is the 1990s, of course. But
just imagining book equivalent of those stalls with movies in the little cloth sleeves, bootleg movies.
Basically, yeah. It's just it's like you're just walking, just oh shit, I want to buy the new Liu Yichang book, but it's too expensive. And he goes hey, Hang Dai, I heard you want to buy the new Liu Yichang book. Guess what? I got it over here early on this disc, and guess what? $2.
That would be cool if that existed. I'm gonna want to build that into something, but.
Maybe if we ever get run out of Toronto, either by gentrification or just people are chasing us down, maybe we should just flee to Taiwan, found one of those spaces out of a Chinese mall, and just sell bootleg books out of there.
Yeah.
Or just sell them off a van or something. But okay, so all right. I did this joke with you before. I'm going to do it again for the sake of the viewers. So, this is the book influenced by Wong Kar-wai. Guess how this fucking book opens?
Wait, am I supposed to actually guess? because I know the answer, so I can't quite
okay.
fake not
right.
knowing. Now.
Okay, I might as well go with it. Like, what's it called? Do you A, write something in the spirit of Wong Kar-wai, similar to the way that his monologues move? Do you B, talk about watching Wong Kar-wai and talk about your experience about it? Or C, just straight up fucking write about Wong Kar-wai? Write what happens in a movie, in Chungking Express. Like,
yeah.
I'm not even joking, man. You can't even make this stuff up right now.
I mean, the weird thing is I can't even tell, like, how much is the book itself trying to be Wong Kar-wai versus how much is it just, like, white reviewers who only know Chinese cinema through Wong Kar-wai were just like, oh, there's a Wong Kar-wai reference in it. It must be kind of like, that must be a valid comparison to make. Like...
Yeah, you mean those kind of people where it's like, you know, you're Chinese, you go up to them, it's like, hi, nice to meet you. I'm like so and so, and they go like, and it's like, so I like, I'm a filmmaker, and they go, oh, I love Wong Kar-wai.
Yeah.
Like, man.
I mean,
like,
even then, like, knowing that exists, it feels kind of gauche and pandery to open your book on a reference to, like, the one Chinese artist your readers are going to have any familiarity with, but...
Yeah. You mean, like, the pretentious kind that are going to be familiar with it? Like, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, like, I only watch Kino films. Have you ever watched Chungking Express? Have you ever watched Cannibal Holocaust? Have you ever watched Crash by fucking that one guy? I don't remember his name.
We are not film people. I mean... Yeah.
Yeah. Fuck film. Fuck film. Johnny To is arguably the most Kino filmmaker ever. Like his romantic comedy. That's just basically the most based of all. My Left Eye Sees Ghosts.
Yeah.
But yeah. So it literally opens like this. I am a can of pineapple. Cop 223 is as well. We're watching Chungking Express. On April 1st, Cop 223's girlfriend, May, leaves him. Cop 223 lets himself believe for a month that May's leave April Fool's joke. He will move on when April ends. As a symbol, he buys 30 cans of pineapple that expire on May 1st. It is now the last day of April. When the clock strikes midnight, Cop 223 eats all 30 cans of pineapple. Naturally, he gets a stomach ache.
The funny thing is, this is describing a Wong Kar-wai film in, like, the least Wong Kar-wai way possible. Because, like, the funny thing about, like, people jumping from the book making this reference to, oh, the book is like Wong Kar-wai, is this is written in just, like, this generic, like, clipped, dry, minimalist alt-lit style. Which, like, Wong Kar-wai is, like, an incredibly, like, lush visual filmmaker who, like, this is, again, I'm not enough of a film person to even know what would be the reference point for this writing style and, like, film style, but I'm guessing, like, The Scary of 61st or something. Like...
Well, there is one quote from a Wong Kar-wai film that I wasn't able to pull up because fucking Google just doesn't know shit about looking up quotes, but there was one where like one of the guys was describing this girl that he's in love with, and he says that he feels like that the guy feels like he himself feels like a shop, and that the girl is just wandering through this shop, and he just hopes that she doesn't leave too soon or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, and that's part of the literary quality of Wong Kar-wai's almost of his prose in a sense. Like one thing that his prose does quite well.
Does he write his own scripts, or does somebody else write his scripts?
I'm not sure. I don't know. But the thing is that I know that the fact that they are inspired by a Hong Kong novelist is like there's probably some kind of pedigree following such. And it's also I think part of what makes it so effective and immediate is because Wong Kar-wai's kind of filming, at least from Tony Leung from fucking Shang-Chi. I still can't believe that shit. Just like all of a sudden you have all these people flocking over going like, oh my gosh, guys, have you heard of this actor, Tony Teo White?
Oh yeah, his Wikipedia page says director, screenwriter, producer, so I think he probably does write his own films.
Yeah, probably, but it's just funny that all of a sudden there's just an obsession with him when it's just like, bruh, like, people had an obsession with Tony Leung Teo White like 30 years ago when he was in either Wong Kar-wai's films or that cop from Infernal Affairs, Tan Wing-yan, and he's like, and what's his name? He was like, and then Lao Dawah goes like, and then he just like points the Glock at him, and then fucking Infernal Affairs, that fucking movie. But no, yeah, so there is an immediate quality to it because it almost feels like their impressions being thought of in the moment, but they're not just that. They're also like really well curated and not even treated, but it's just like they flow in a way that, like really good novels, they're visceral. They destabilize. Like even if it's trying to be witty, like it still breaks it down a little bit. So it's not. It doesn't just feel like you don't feel like they're trying to be smart. Like they're trying to be smart. Like even that one line about the guy feeling like he's a shot that the girl he loves is wandering around in. Like the point isn't the fact that. The point is not really about the fact that he made an image about shops. It's more about the visceral nature of like this kind of aimlessness, this kind of like what would you call it? Not particularly emptiness, but a kind of like spaciousness within the self, I guess.
Yeah.
That people wander through like in such a subtle and immediate way, using the visceral image of the prose, which is effective in the sense of like it's effective, it's arresting. It's like the way that my boy talks about how great prose like fires off chemicals in your brain, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas in Sheung King's book, it feels like it's trying to do the same thing, but it's trying to make the language feel more naked of all things, in the sense that it's trying to do the same thing, but almost stripped back with just the language itself to be effective. But it comes across with a lot of its own problems. Where, for example, there's a scene where he talks about a point when he was young, when he got his first job, when he got a job that pays like shit in Hong Kong for a summer. For like a summer job, and when he showed his dad, he did all the calculations for some fucking reason, and was like, yeah, this job pays less than minimum wage, and his dad just like laughs him off going like, haha, that sucks, like that doesn't yeah, you gotta experience this this painfulness or whatever. And the thing is that it doesn't go into any more than that, and the problem is that is like that scene like by itself like does hit a particular kind of trauma that young Asian people face like with their parents in regards to like sort of the unfairness of like a neoliberal capitalist system. But obviously it doesn't go there. What it does do is that it mostly shows the scene in the same way that it shows that scene in Chungking Express, but it's just that it doesn't leave any kind of exploration onto why his dad is so like blasé to the fact that his son realizes that the system is that capitalism is not good and is adverse to the good life, whereas like. But the only impression you get from the whole thing is that, wow, this guy's dad's an asshole.
Yeah.
But the exploration doesn't go any farther than for example, because there's such thing as intergenerational trauma, but does it ever get brought up here? No. Like, how about the fact that, for example, like, people who lived in Hong Kong were, for example, like, ruled by the British, and they weren't ruled by the British, they were ruled by, they were ruled by corrupt cops and triads, essentially. Then again, of course, that becomes a gray area there, because it's not like the triads were completely just like, they were like, it's all bad over there or anything like that. But it's just more like the fact that being in a colony and being in this constant state of precarity, like to the point that basically back in the day, mainlanders would flee to Hong Kong because the old country was in disarray. Like, it was completely destroyed, and the only way to really make a living was basically, even for ex-soldiers, was to just like go in and become a triad member, like rob some jewelry stores and or join like one of the many gangs on offer, whether it was the Sun Society, the 14K, or the Wo Shing Wo.
And this is interesting because it's a contrast with Wayson Choi's Jade, Peony, which I read, where the characters talk about all this constantly to a point that it feels kind of heavy-handed. But
yeah, like, oh man, do you remember the old country? Remember when there were some headless people on the road? Yeah, I remember that shit. Oh man.
Yeah.
But actually, just on the note of just trauma in itself, like, I think the thing that bugs the shit out of me actually is, well, for one thing, like, reading through it, I think one of the main thoughts that I wanted to say was, well, one, the intertext of this book is one of the most annoying parts of the entire thing, because this constantly references a million other books, and to the point of being like extremely repetitive, where like the girl in the relationship of this book is constantly going like, hey, can you tell me a story? And of course, like, the guy has to, of course, it almost feels like a forced attempt to talk about, like, basically Chinese proverbial stories or something, and having to analyze them while they're fucking, or just like while they're, well, not while they're fucking, but while they're going to the grocery store.
I feel like this is like an inverse. This seems like an inverse of the character in Dale's Faceless in Nippon, the girl who like meets up with Dale's narrator character and is just like full-time LARPing as a Haruki Murakami character and just like inhabiting the Orient through stories, like this same kind of like
Man, don't get me started on Haruki Murakami. Well, now that you mentioned Faceless in Nippon, because I was even thinking of Faceless in Nippon too, the one thing that it gets kind of right is the sort of visceral feeling of feeling so out of place, like the scene where like the narrator feels like their body feels like extremely flabby in the dark while they're trying to like kill bugs or something in the apartment. Like, that part like really translates so much of the alienation without him having to say how alienated he feels, other than just going to his job and people just not teaching English and just like slacking.
Yeah. Wait, are you talking about Faceless in Nippon or about Sheung right now?
Faceless in Nippon, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is in a way like more Wong Kar-wai, because like that story has so many good that book has so many good just sort of like alone scenes and just sort of like scenes of spaces, the manga kisa, the various encounters on the streets with like the fortune teller, like a sort of just sense of space and body and aloneness that are hard to capture when you're doing that like minimal alt-lit writing style where you can't really even take much time to describe anything or to sort of dwell with the physicality of the world or the spatiality of it.
Yeah, like, essentially, even the first bit of Faces in Nippon literally has a visceral image of, like, the guy of walking through, like, a street in like, evening Tokyo, and empathizing with like a can of Boss coffee that's been dented in, and how it forms like kind of a canyon of light from the dent, and that's like that really captures like the space in the same way that Wong Kar-wai captures spaces in his films, or even like Johnny To, just like capturing almost minuscule, if you want to do the whole creative writing thing, specific telling detail regarding like the state of affairs. Like, it says so much more than just like even this paragraph about Chungking Express. That just like, you know what? Actually, I was even thinking of The Great Gatsby too, for two scenes actually, because part of the thing that bugs me the most about this book in general, and just and in my own experience, it almost feels like it's trying to elicit like a tributary emotion from me, in the same way that when Daisy is talking about this goes on this whole thing where she's like what's it called, I asked the nurse if it was going to be a boy or a girl, and she said it was a girl, and I wept, and I said I was glad it was a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's all a girl could be in this world, a beautiful little fool. And then like while Nick is like believing her for a second, she then goes on this weird, not even weird, but just kind of like facetious kind of thing where she's like, I've been everywhere and done everything. God, I'm sophisticated or whatever. And then Nick feels like almost entirely cheated of the entire like he no longer empathized with Daisy in that regard. Like, this is kind of what it feels like here in this, except for like showing these scenes where it's like it's trying to get me to relate to them, and to some degree I do relate to them, but it's trying to force me to be like, it's like, yeah, that feel when it's like, what the fuck, no, like, what is this?
Yeah, well, that's a thing I feel like with contemporary, I guess, like the contemporary sort of literature of identity, and I don't mean that in like a wokeness, like racial identity or sexual identity sense, but the sense of like that we were talking about on the Reactionary Lit podcast, where it's like the sort of confessional thing, and you're just like the autofiction, you're just sort of showing your life with no sort of mediation, and then the point is just for people to relate to it and find it relatable. And like that's why I think the most interesting literature now is coming out of just like deeply weird people who just would not be relatable if they told you about their lives. So they have to actually explain shit, and they have to actually like think about shit and where they fit into the world, and like why it fits together that way.
Yeah, like I mean, if anything, actually, just to move on a bit through Sheung King's book, the second paragraph after this whole thing about like Chungking Express is the ancient Chinese scholar Guo Po writes, at the age of 50, a fox can transform into a person. At the age of 100, it has a choice to either metamorphose into a wizard or become a seducer. It can now know of happenings 1,000 li away. It can bewitch people, leading them astray and causing them to lose their wits. At the age of 1,000, it can communicate with the heavens and become a celestial fox. And then it says, on one of our first dates, you suggest that we go to a zoo to see some foxes. The foxes in the zoo have yet to turn 50. They walk around on 4 legs and lie on the ground and smell like skunks. You smell nice and have the most elegant walk. I just went on a date yesterday, I tell a friend the next day. How was it? Great. So nice. Where did you go? The zoo. The zoo? Yeah, we saw these foxes. I don't want to hear about foxes, he interjects. Tell me about the girl. You prefer wrapping your arms around mine to holding hands. I like it when you do that. It makes me feel like I, too, have an elegant walk. You enjoy jazz, and your skin is soft. Okay, on that last section, right, if we're going to compare prose, the thing is that on the, like, okay, you prefer wrapping your arms around mine to holding hands. I like it when you do that. It makes me feel like I, too, have an elegant walk. Like, that's like a very effective line in the sense of, like, I like it when you do that. Yeah. Because it's supposed to, like, without having to describe it, but try to get that emotion of, like, of a specific kind of sophisticated pleasure. But the thing is, if this really was Wong Kar-wai, if this really was, holding true to its influences, then this would have been, well, not even much longer even. It would have been a lot more descriptive of, like, it would have still kept the I like it when you do that. That kind of feels like immediate kind of prose like Wong Kar-wai, but it would have went into, like, the specificities of like
walk,
this walk.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, or even like, or even jazz, considering jazz like brought up. But that's it. Like, that's literally all you get. That's not to say that this is the entire thing. Like, there are parts that are strong. Like, I'll even find it because I remember I read you one part that was that actually felt strong. Like here, it is almost midnight on the last day of May. Suddenly I have the feeling that you might disappear once May is over, that you will return to the heavens, to walk on the clouds, leaving me behind. I feel a chill, and all the blood in my body turns cold. I clench my fists and watch the clock turn 12. I open my eyes. You are still here, next to me. I am relieved. But to be safe, I must ask you a very important question. Do you like pineapples? I whisper. Or rather, do you like pineapples? I whisper. You are asleep, but I am less than 1,000 li away. You should be able to hear me. Like, this is Wong Kar-wai. This is strong. But the thing is that it's never this strong, like, throughout the book. Like, throughout the book, it's mostly Chinese myth, very stripped down, like, conversations where it's just you, and then it's dialogue, me, and dialogue. Like, again, it's trying to be stripped down in the sense of being naked, in the sense of, like, this is what it looks like the conversation looks like without any embellishments. But the fact that there's no embellishments makes it less it feels like less like it's less able to draw in the reader. If anything, like it's almost more alienating to the point that it's almost like a meme. Like, I feel more inclined to make fun of it rather than to, like, feel like invested in it. Although I'm kind of sensing that someone's gonna go like, oh, but that's the point. This alienation of the reader and the experience is supposed to be the point. And it's just like,
well, that was like the entire argument around like Tao Lin and Alt Lin, which again, like a lot of this is essential. Actually, I wonder if Tao Lin could have. Tao Lin is a guy who, like, is a, like, Taiwanese diaspora guy and almost never was pigeonholed into that identity. Like, nobody ever really talks about that in relation to his work, despite the fact that he wrote a book called Taipei, that, like, about half of which is about him visiting his parents in Taipei. And to be fair, I remember absolutely nothing about, like, what he has to say about, like, I don't remember him saying much of anything about, like, Taipei and its relation to America or his relation to his parents or anything in that book. Like, I just remember drugs and vibes. But, like...
Drugs and vibes? I mean, what is this, 2010s? Oh, wait.
Well, yeah, that's Tao Lin. Yeah. So I guess, like, Tao Lin is in some ways, like, maybe the ultimate, like, assimilated Asian diaspora writer. And the way you're describing this seems very assimilated at the level of writing style, insofar as the writing style is almost identical to Tao Lin, but then, like, also, like, sticks in these, like, signifiers of, like, Asianness compulsively, in a way that say Tao Lin doesn't, but that just seems almost like compensation for this. Although I'm not sure, like, is there anything at the level of prose style that you would consider, like, characteristic of diaspora writing, apart from, like, the food metaphors thing? Like,
or the myth, or the constant references to myth.
Yeah, but I mean that's like not actually, that's just content. That's not style, is the thing.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
What is
I get
the
a sense
style
that, like,
that?
when I was, I'm sorry.
No, keep going. Yeah.
I feel like I sense that there is a kind of almost like a house style for or Asian writers in the same way that how like light novels have this house style of being like clean, minimal, like teen novel prose.
Oh.
But less artificial to that degree. Like there's like it almost feels like, because I read a little bit of Wayson Choi. You've seen me read
that
Wayson
is what that's actually that's how the prose in that felt. Like it was like well written YA. Like YA before that was a genre. Like
but maybe like but not but YA aside, like I feel like part of it has to do with a certain kind of
actually is that a trope of the diaspora thing? Because I feel like a lot of Amy Tan, I don't know Amy Tan that well, but I feel like the books of hers I've heard about are like about kids growing up in an Asian family. Like it's not. Is that true? Like or no?
That sounds like that sounds pretty plausible.
I might be wrong, actually. Because, well, no, the one's about the wife, the mother. Like, I feel like that's a thing that I've come across a lot, but I'm not really sure.
Right. Like, the one thing I was also going to say was that even in Wayson Choi's book, despite my own problems with what I read at the time, there does seem like a very particular kind of gravitas in the way that the prose moves from moment to moment. Like gravitas, like seriousness could be one way to describe it, but it's not the complete picture, if you know what I mean. Like, part of it has to do with the fact that in Wayson Choi's part of the voice has like strong like filial piety vibes, like in the sense of like the mom and dad are always referred to as father and mother, or if you want to, if you really want to get into it, the grandmother is referred to as Paul, like, which is, that's true, but are you really going to say every single time grandmother comes up, you say grandmother or Paul? Because, like, the thing is that if this was being localized, right, like, Paul would just be excised in the same way that, for some localizers, right, they just straight up get rid of all the honorifics because they just sound awkward in English. I mean, granted, honorifics and Paul aren't like a big deal, like in the grand scheme of things. Like that's not the problem. In like when we're talking about localizing, what is a problem is something like, well, to go off the visual novel example, like describing gura as just gura. Like if you said to someone, "Hey, I'm feeling gura," like in English, like. Doesn't make any fucking sense. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Well, that's where it feels like there's a very weird double standard or double consciousness between how the West thinks about, like, diaspora versus, like, actual foreign art. Because, like, in not just Asian, but all kinds of, like, Latino, for instance, diaspora literature, there will be, like, or African, like, diaspora literature. There will be, like, constantly this trope of just, like, leaving random words untranslated, like, entirely, just as, like, a stylistic thing, just to sort of, like, give it kind of, like, cultural flavor and show that, like, English is not the dominant language of the speaker's consciousness, essentially. And then, like, in, even in, like, the sort of extremely woke, like, translation, world, there's this, like, actually intensifying pressure to localize everything and make it seem like and this idea that having anything that would give a reader a hint that it's not taking place in America would be, like, othering. Whereas when you are in America, that otherness is, like, a sign of pride. But, like, and then sort of, like, this, like, local sort of, this badge of a particular identity. But having that, like, that ethnic distinction where it's not meant as a badge of a, like, exotic foreign identity within America, where it is actually the backdrop, then, like, you can't actually show it at all. I think that's a really interesting paradox in how the West approaches translation and markers of identity right now.
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. Because the thing is that and it could be effective. The only thing is that there's always the risk of it feeling like flavor text in the same way that if there are diaspora books that are kind of like marketed off of just gold mining trauma from either like childhood or the old country, it would just be like gold mining shit like the occasional Chinese word here here and there, just to like give it that flavor, to make you know that this is like in a Chinese perspective, when really like there are other things that make someone that relate more to like in an Asian household without having to like outright be like in Chinese, like even for something like Turning Red, or even Sheung King's book, like there are scenes that show these kinds of the kind of complex relationship the parents have with their children, like to the point of being almost like that really bitter argument from The Great Gatsby, where like Tom says to Gatsby, there are things that that we have experienced together that you have no part of, or that you have no experience of, especially to a common swindler such as yourself, or something like that. Those kinds of scenes really illustrate these tensions. But of course, in Turning Red, these moments are just kind of like flanderized, and then in Sheung King's book, it's not really given much exploration than just, that's just how it is being Chinese. Reddit / Asian parent stories.
I mean, I think politically that double standard I think it actually has something to do with the contradictions of liberal politics at the moment, where there was this sort of like around when everyone started getting woke and getting really into racial politics and representation, and also immigration, that became a huge flashpoint, and all the liberals were claiming to support open borders and unlimited immigration and putting immigrant stories everywhere. There was simultaneously this complete disappearance of any interest in the rest of the world, outside America. And I've talked about, in Great Defamiliarization, I talk about how, after Coney 2012, the sort of idea of the liberal who's sort of a bleeding heart and cares about third world countries just disappears. There's...
Do you remember back in school, in primary school, you would hear about countries like Darfur, or
it's not a country, but yeah. But yeah.
It used to be a huge thing back in the mid 2000s.
Yeah, exactly.
All of a sudden, it's just fucking gone. If anything, if someone literally just said, "Oh, those countries were just annihilated overnight by a massive bomb," then
and it feels like the sort of paradox of racial politics that emerged in the 2010s was essentially that, non-white people are, matter and are even, all important if they, leave their countries and come here and become part of the American North or Western project. And we will completely overhaul all of Western identity at the cost of in exchange for never having to hear about anywhere outside the West again. Which is interesting because it's at the same time that non-Western media started actually pushing into the Western cultural sphere, and stuff like anime started getting really big. And and ironically then you had these weird moments where the racist, like, alt-right people in the West were defining their identity around anime because, and simultaneously claiming that, like, all of Western media now was too politically correct and diverse.
Actually, one thing I want to say, because you mentioned this as well, about, like, how sort of the rest of the world no longer existed, like, when one takes on the American project, is that what's interesting then is that the rest of the world ends up feeling like a sort of abstract violence that is constantly surrounding the Americas, which is interesting because, in a way, like, that's sort of, like, just talking about abstraction, right? That literally is kind of like a very particular modern condition in the sense of, like, yeah, like, Ukraine's getting fucked right now by Russia, but of course, like, all that is being mediated by, by news reports, by, like, Twitter feeds, people just, like, getting fucking, like, either Russia pilled or Ukraine pilled, or even just, like, China itself. That idea of annihilation, like, pretty much that it's kind of an interesting metaphor then that essentially the entire world is kind of made of these kind of forces of violence and exchange that the American project either has no idea of, or they just, like, try so hard to try to, like, cover it up because it's the such exchange is so nebulous, so violent, so almost naked in a sense that it's like it's almost frightening to encounter. Like, in the same way that in Johnny Toe's election, how, like, all the violence is extremely brutal, whether it's, like, it's Kuhn beating Big Head with the branch, or Locke hitting Big D with the rock over and over again.
Yeah. We should have read some, like, Ocean Vuong. That we should have put.
Oh man, Ocean Vuong. Actually, let's talk a little about Ocean Vuong, because I mean,
I haven't read any Ocean Vuong in ages, so I can't really speak to him. But he's also, I guess, like a sort of, like, voice of the new wave of diaspora literature, and, like, for better or worse, like, one of the few people doing something really original with style. Like, yeah, like, generally Ocean Vuong, like, even though I've read most of their work in passing, like, it was generally, like, of a pretty high quality, but just that what Ocean Vuong kind of did was that they kind of, like, brought back a sort of poetic gravitas to poetry, like a kind of a gravitas to voice, in a sense, that they kind of felt. Well, I got embarrassed about misgendering Ocean Vuong, but then, like, went on the Wikipedia page, and the Wikipedia page is still using he/him pronouns, so probably Wikipedia is wrong, but, somebody should edit that.
Damn, come on, Wikipedia-tan, what are you doing? But, Wikipedia-tan is what's it called? Misgendering people, what are you doing? But anyway, what's it called? No, yeah, like, what's interesting is that Ocean Vuong brought back a kind of gravitas to poetry, because at the time I imagine that a lot of poetry was a lot of postmodern, self-reflexive, irony, David Foster Wallace type shit. But then, like, having someone kind of approach the poetic form with a kind of, well, authenticity, or dare I say sincerity, I guess, like, really fell in line with a lot of, like, writers who were writing either in the confessional mode, or if they were, let's say, Mark D. Severio, like, bringing back the poetic form to an extent, or if you're Stanford Sheung, like, doing something effective and arresting with language, but not in the way that people would think to use language. Like, it really felt like one of the epicenters of this changing kind of landscape for prose, or what prose can really do, or even, like, prose and poetry can really do as a medium towards the visceral. Like, that was that was something interesting. Ocean Vuong did, for sure.
Yeah, and that's where, like, my feelings about Ocean Vuong, all the times I've read their work, like, I sort of have mixed feelings where, like, I think also trying to do something very similar to what they're doing, And, like, I guess there's a sort of rivalry, like, dynamic there to, like, okay, who's going to, like, bring back the lyrical, and, like, and I mean, ultimately, all of us are in different ways, but then we get sort of, like, fixated on the differences between those ways, and I feel like the thing that frustrates me with Ocean Vuong is that it's almost too much that, like, I had a Facebook status that I think Jake Byrne got kind of mad at me about that was like, Ocean Vuong's poems read like they were written in the Doki Doki Literature Club poetry generator.
I remember it, yeah.
And the thing, like, I don't necessarily stand by that, but the thing I meant by it was that essentially, like, every word and image in them is something that, like, you could, that seems like the most, like, poetic possible image, like, the most sort of heightened possible, like, metaphor to invoke. And it's almost kind of restrictive. It almost feels like a return to, and this is, again, like, I'm also myself talking about, like, neo-romanticism, but it feels like in some ways a return to the 19th century where you had, like, a code of poetic diction and certain words you could use in poetry and certain words you couldn't. And, like, I like trying to do that that sort of intensity while having, like, the widest possible range of sort of reference and imagery. But, like, it is incredibly dense with that imagery. Like, it is always doing something. And that is something that's similar to how I approach it. It's almost like show-offy, and I've maybe gotten less like that since last time I was writing poetry seriously. But, yeah. But yeah, what were we gonna say about them in the context of, because, like, that sort of presence of violence and, like, the sort of marks of violence outside the West, and, like, its sort of transmission through intergenerational trauma seems to be one of the really big things in their work, and I have not read it nearly recently enough to say anything about how it deals with or speaks to that.
Right.
But that's why I thought
it was more of like I guess it was more of a footnote because we just remembered them.
Yeah.
But I guess, like, going through, like, I think the thing, like, I guess to sort of sum up my thoughts about, because there are two things I want to hit about Sheung King's book. One, the fact that, like that strong section, there are quite a few sections that are interesting. Like, for example, there's a guy that the narrator talks to, talking about this idea of, like, the Weightless Society. Although I don't really agree with it per se, but it's more effective because it's literally an exploration of a certain mindset. Like this quote here from where there's no, like, okay, I'll go near the beginning. He says, did you get better at math? Not at all. I still failed my exam. I never went back to the tutorial. A couple months later, the instructor finally got sued and the class got canceled. But that is not to say I didn't learn anything. What can you possibly learn from having your head slammed on a table? I was still terrible at math. I just couldn't understand it. I was good at every subject except for math. For some reason, numbers just don't register with me like language and images do. I'm an editor and photographer for a magazine, by the way. Cool, but I'm sorry. What did you learn from that guy? Getting back to why I will not raise my children here in Macau. Okay. There's no wait here. If you graduate from high school, you're eligible to work at a casino. You get paid by the government every year, and all you have to do is shuffle cards. There's no wait. No threat that you're going to be fucked if you don't try hard. There's no fear that someone will slam your face on the table if you don't do well enough. The reality in Macau is not the reality of life or fucking up. It does not carry much consequences. The government gives us a safety net, money, and employment. We are raised to believe we can do whatever we want once our financial needs are met. But Macau is a society of control. We can't escape what they really want us to do. That is to help maintain what Macau is, a place filled with tourists and casinos. I don't want my child to grow up in a controlled and weightless society. Ironically, I think without weight and confinement, having ambition becomes more difficult. Sometimes I still think about that guy who slammed my head against a table. I hate him, but I think that having that fear and hatred is sometimes helpful. You know what I mean? Yes, but that doesn't seem too healthy. How old are you? Wait, let me guess. 20? Yes, how'd you know? And then it just goes on this thing about Polaroids. That idea about the weightless society is interesting because there is, ironically, like a kind of weight to it in the sense that it speaks to a certain kind of abstraction, but having to equate that to like pain in the same way of like Alice Florida shoes the drunks, where it's like, oh, you have to get hazed, you have to experience this traumatic incident in order to become a man. Like is a little bit like, yeah, okay, buddy, like because it's like it almost feels like those kind of talking points people talk about, like, oh, why communism is bad or whatever, and it's like, oh, there's no consequences, there's no actually like controlling or whatever, I mean, if you really want to argue about it, like really, like the fact that he's right about the fact that there's a feeling of no weight, but the feeling of no weight has less to do with the fact that the government gives them money. It's more to do with the fact of what Macau is. Macau is the Las Vegas of China. It's this wasteland where there's just big-ass casinos that just, like, tower over a fucking desert. Like, you remember not really a desert, but you remember, like, when we were driving around, like, remember you see those spaces where it's just big-ass corporate parks in the middle of nowhere?
Yeah.
That's Macau. Like, that's Macau, like, .png. Like to a degree. Like inside those places, you have these lush, like Venice style, like malls and shit. But like going outside is like it is fucking like annihilating.
Yeah.
Like you'd have parts like this, and also one thing that's super ironic about the whole thing is the fact that he talks about another book called fuck it. Hold on. Let me find the name of this fucking book. Let's see. The Vegetarian by, I don't know who this fucking writer is. I swear to fuck. Fuck. Vegetarian. Come on, give me them crops, man. Give me them crops, man. Oh, fuck. Oh, jeez. And I feel like the meme of this entire novel is just the narrator saying, have you read X? Have you watched X?
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, The Vegetarian, he talks about this, it's a surreal feminist novel about...
oh, yeah, I've heard of this novel. I almost read it one point.
Can you give me the background before
I did not actually read it. I was, like, planning to read it. It was one of the novels that, like, when I was out busking, like, I saw it chapters and was like, okay, I'll start reading this, like, on my breaks at chapters, but then I think I got distracted and started reading something else. But, like, it seems to be about this woman who, what was the premise again? Like, I don't even remember the premise now.
Yeah, you can look it up real quick.
Like, it has a very distinct, it's just this woman who stops eating meat after having this weird nightmare, and I think it's just a bigger deal in her social context than, like, it would be here. She's married, she's a sort of, like, standard South Korean housewife. I think her husband thinks this is really weird and is kind of abusive, and it's just this sort of, like, tension of, like, can we get this woman to act normal again? Like, what the fuck's going on with her? Almost feels like a sort of, like, yellow wallpaper kind of thing, but that was the sense I got, but I haven't actually read it.
Okay. Force feed her meat?
Yeah,
exactly. To the point that she has a psychotic break, takes off, like, all her clothes and runs out to the street and just, like, cradles, like, a small bird and asks her husband if she truly did something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Okay, so just for a bit of context, basically in this half of the novel, essentially the guy and the girl who've been seeing each other for the past while, like they kind of like go their separate ways a little bit until she invites him to go see her in Prague because she's now this this like not even, I don't know, maybe not like a famous artist, but like a sculpture like sculpturist, I guess. But so she meets her and this guy that she's traveling with named Harold Lee, which imagine like your like basically the opposite of the narrator, who is he's like very well off, like put together like Asian 30 something named Harold Lee, who dresses in like Burberry Burberry suits and whatever, but basically Chinese Psycho, American Psycho, but like or oh no, not even Chinese Psycho. Just picture the guys from Office from Johnny Toe.
Yeah. Okay.
Those guys, and essentially just like the narrator having a fucking hate boner at the fact like, oh man, like I really hope my girl's not fucking this guy. But anyway,
incidentally, one thing I remember getting the sense of from this book when you described it was it seemed sort of like a sort of straight fuckboy writing that like probably like he could not have gotten away with, not only if he wasn't Asian, but like if he wasn't constantly sticking sort of like identity signifiers into it and was writing it like Tao Lin. Like, yeah, would that be accurate, or did I?
Yeah, that is pretty accurate throughout the whole thing. I mean, if anything, what's funny is that it ends on this almost like cliche romantic comedy like image, and it's just like, this is how you choose to end this. Also, this guy should have. If this guy really was Wong Kar-wai, you know what he should have did?
What?
Talk to his stuffed animals, because at least that would have given so much more levity. Like, honestly, like this guy straight up, instead of going like, where's my like Japanese girlfriend going now? No, just like talk to fucking Garfield, like Garfield and who was the other stuffed toy in there? I don't remember.
Was there like a Hello Kitty, or am I being racist?
I think it was Hello Kitty. I mean, what was it? Man, like, I think you're underestimating the fucking cultish obsession with Hello Kitty that's prevalent in Hong Kong.
Okay. Anyway, get back to the story you were telling. Like,
yeah. So basically, Harold Lee goes on this whole thing where he's like, so that's the kind of stuff that sells these days, is Harold Lee's response. What do you mean by kind of stuff? Weird, surreal feminist stories that make a mockery of the ignorance of men? And trendy, he sips his champagne. I think there's more to it than I'm sure there is, he says, cutting you off. But a book like that is so easy to market. You know what I mean? It's obviously written for middle-aged women who are unhappy with their lives. A great target audience. They have time, money, and the emotional vulnerability that requires art and culture to fill a void. Give the book a vibrant colored cover, make it win an award or two, and then voila! All there is left to do is sit tight and wait for the cash to flood in. You are lost for words. Harold Lee continues. You said the book is narrated by the husband, right? Yes. And he's irritated by his wife acting strangely? He is. Brilliant. Men who are frustrated by feminists who would buy the book as well. People think these books are transgressive and whatnot, but in reality, it's just about appealing to the ideologies that are fashionable at the time. If you play your cards right, you profit. That's how the world works. She's a Korean writer from a small city that no one's ever heard of, and now her books are being sold in Prague. You see how far you can get by knowing how to play the game? Before you can respond, your ex-girlfriend returns, and all the attention in the room shifts toward her. She simply says, "Let's go," picks up her purse, puts on her coat, thanks Harold Lee, and leaves. You thank Harold Lee, and he gives you another handshake, hug, and a later, bruh.
Wow. What were you gonna say about that? Like,
yeah, okay, so first off, like, again, this kind of the lack of exploration, like, this is a part where you would think that there would be some kind of exploration regarding this, sort of, where the kind of background that Harold Lee might come from. Also, this is the kind of shit where, like, I'm sure it's, like, a thing, but, like, man, how many people do you hear in the background going, base, red pill,
It actually kind of felt like that. That actually sort of sounded like a monologue from, like, sounded like an Inyo Asano monologue. Like, sounded like something from Dead Dead Demons, Dead Dead Destruction.
Oh, you know what? Yeah, like, it literally feels like an Oyasumi Pun Pun where, like, the teacher's like, "What's wrong, Pun Pun? Don't tell me you didn't do it." What did you do? That's all you're supposed to do. It just, like, smashes his head on the table over and over again. Like, it does feel like that, but at the same time, like, it's also very, like, ironic, not even in, like, a
No, I mean, it sounds
way.
more like what's her name's, like, cynical, like, it sounds like Anton's cynical brother in Dead Dead Demons, who's like, I recently retweeted the page of him, the shut-in, who's like, essentially a Twitter troll, who, like, there was the page where he's like, let me find it. Oh, 2 seconds. Oh yeah, yeah. The Prime Minister held a press conference last night, so I'm going to be busy on social media trolling the know-it-all egomaniacs on the left and right. I'm going to spam them with cat balls. That'll wake them up. The left and right combine to make the ballsack of society.
Yeah, like, it's like, this sounds like some of, like, the super transgressive, like, not even transgressive, like, it almost feels, but like, this is some, like, banal black pill shit. But I think the biggest irony of all is the fact that this book is kind of like what this guy is describing. Not like, but maybe not like the Korean writer from, like, a small city, but the idea where it's like, what was it? Not even appealing to ideologies or anything like that. Well, I mean, that's part of it, but
I mean, I was listening to that the whole time and going, like, he's not wrong, but like,
yeah, like, this guy's not wrong. Like, this guy, like, this, you know, like, I can't believe that this fucking guy, like, spoke, you know, from a business background, because he says he works for a trading company. Like, this fucking moneyed up Chinese businessman, basically, like, just spit some facts right here.
Well, like, because he's from this business background, so he understands the business dimension of the literary business, and, like, I keep thinking, like, I'm not sure what you mean by going further into it, but it's kind of like the narrator just who has presumably read the book. I haven't read the book. Like, there probably is more to it. I can only, like, speak to the marketing. But, like, the narrator who has presumably read the book, not only doesn't offer a defense, like, he doesn't actually give any indication that he has one or really has an appreciation of the book beyond this, and, like, that he just sort of, like, takes the L. It sounds like the thing in, like the Dime Square play where, like, the soy millennial artists keep getting cucked by, like, the Chad older New York art sleaze bags or something.
Right.
It only seems to get inserted into the story as this weird self-deprecating thing where it's like, I mean, this is right, but you can't say that, but, like, we know it's sort of right, but we're gonna sort of hedge it because, like, I'm in this business too. And if there is anything else, it's sort of unsayable because of this writing, not just the writing style, but also the sort of, like, let me just make sure we're still streaming. But, like, the, like, artistic philosophy that makes it unthinkable to try and express these deeper dimensions of a story beyond its sort of, like, marketable surface characteristics.
Yeah, because, like, the thing is that the kind of emotional tension in this is supposed to be the fact that the narrator is kind of appalled by, like, what he hears. right? But the thing is that the weird irony about the entire thing is that the book itself is kind of marketed, towards Asian Canadians, or like
it's marketed towards Asian Canadian millennials, which is a somewhat or actually, I'm not even sure is it? I feel like the market of this is, I got the sense this is just a book for millennial lit people, like creative writing program kind of. And I feel like most of those people are they are reading widely in terms of identities. Like if you are someone who reads the entire Metatron catalog, you are going to read the Indigenous Metatron book and the Latino Metatron book and the Asian Metatron book, and they're all kind of very similar in a lot of ways, despite having this wider range of identities. And conversely, if you are just of that identity and not reading Metatron books, you're probably not going to read the X Identity Metatron book. It's not like Mark DiSaverio, who, despite not marketing this way at all, has an audience of boomer Italians who probably do not read any contemporary literature other than Mark DiSaverio.
Man. There's a certain kind of contradiction that feels bitterly ironic in a way that's that's probably not intended, but also just it just speaks to a certain maybe not cynicism per se, but it's almost it's sort of spelling out what this book kind of is, but the book doesn't do anything to try and avoid
resist
that.
It. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into to finish off this particular section. Also, again, this is the way that this is shown is again with very little with very little exploration. It's just mostly showing this guy's kind of being kind of well, not ignorance, not the word, but kind of being what's the word? Not ignorant per se, but being dismissive. Yeah, he's being dismissive. Yeah. Well, and that kind of makes and I kind of want to move in a little bit, actually to the middle section of the book, because in the middle section of the book, particularly, there's a part where the narrator talks about their experiences of being discriminated against through microaggressions, and he characterizes this almost feeling like a whole, in the same way that how trauma is kind of framed in something like omori, or some it almost trivializes it. If repression within an Asian household is represented as turning into a red panda in Turning Red, then in this it's represented as a hole. And this hole appears whenever when when the narrator's playing basketball and some random guy calls him a skinny chink or something, and then the hole deepens or something, and or when someone goes oh, you're not supposed to wear sweatpants in what's it called, in a club, when he's really in a restaurant. It's the hole deepens, and it kind of alludes that the reason why the guy and the girl even got together was because they understood this sensation of the whole. But it's just that because it tethers onto this idea of the whole so fucking badly, it just it just makes me lose all sense of of relating to it, especially and also the thing is that well this is probably something where the a certain group will go oh, it's because it's being woke, it's being it's being run by liberals, but man, some of these microaggressions are kind of really over the top in terms of just cherry picking the worst things that happen, when really at least in my experience, some of the worst bits of trauma, or at least realizing that you're not in a country that you can swiftly belong in, almost all of it is in much more subtle ways. Yeah, but this does not show that. This is if anything, what's actually more heartbreaking is that near the end of the book, like, there's this fucking thing where, like, the guy kind of freaks out while he goes to in a church, and he goes and he realizes, like, oh, I realized I fucking hate British people because they ruined Hong Kong, and he hated, like, Christianity and all this other stuff, like, basically hating, like, the colonial powers that kind of over Hong Kong, and it's heartbreaking because, like, I understand that to a degree, but it's like this guy is not directly mad at, like, British people or anything, or even Christianity for that matter. This guy is mad at capitalism, but does he realize it? Does it even, like, you know, bring that up? No, but, like, the tension is there, but it never goes that far. It's always just you know, someone called me someone called me like, you know, like a racial epithet, or it's all because of, like, white people, like, almost.
Well, that's where there's always a sort of interesting tension, and I think this is, like, a good way to transition into Turning Red, between, like, this sort of, like, on one hand, like, I want to define my sort of identity entirely in opposition to the West, whiteness, etc. But on the other hand, like, there's this desire to assimilate to that, and the sort of current, like, diaspora writing is very much about, like, or just seems to be sort of in a push and pull between those things. And on one hand, like, there's this this sort of tendency now to be like, yeah, America is structurally racist, white people ruined every other culture, civilization on Earth, but also, like, we don't want to go back to, like, the old traditions. We don't want to go back to, like, Shenyun, China before communism. Like, we want to...
We're not going to come.
We want to... And we don't want... And we definitely don't want... We cannot say we want to, like, assimilate into a new sort of multipolar or Eastern-centric world order, like somebody like Logo would be arguing. Like, we can't identify with that, so we have to, like, identify with America and find this way to identify with America from this marginalized perspective. And I think to some extent the fact of, like, the sort of, like, pivot towards revising the Western and American identity as this multicultural one from dominant institutions is partly a response to the sort of multipolar threat to the American world order, and the fact that, like, and our population growth is dependent on immigrants, or we're dependent on people from places that we screwed over for centuries, and those places are also in their own right, like, coming into a degree of international power they didn't have before. We don't want people to identify with China, and, like, again, I'm not coming from the position of, like, oh, this is based, like, I don't necessarily want everyone to identify with Xi Jinping's China either, but I think it produces very sort of, like, and this is more noticeable when it's coming from the top, from corporations like Disney, like, very strange sort of, like, discourse incentives, and ways people frame their experiences, like, to try and avoid doing, and I'm not sure how much that is avoidable, because, like, Like, again, I sort of want to build an alternative to all the geopolitical blocks from below, but like what that would look like culturally would necessarily have to be multicultural in some sense, but there is no sort of multicultural culture other than Americanized world culture, and Americanized world culture is now trying to sort of assume this role as multicultural. Actually, that's not true, because like multicultural, actually, like anime is like a multicultural world culture at this point. Like fucking like everyone in like Mexico will like paint Goku on their taco stands. Like probably more people, like I probably, like certainly more people in the global south have watched any given Shonen Jump thing than have watched Turning Red.
Yeah, I mean, even making the joke that if I think the only country that could localize, Shaman King with any respect is probably the South Americans.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, because I remember my boy was even saying, I think you might remember this from back then. It was like, yeah, no, the South Americans really love Shaman King, or just like shonen anime in general.
Yeah. I'd be very curious about, like, Shaman King's reception there in particular, because there's so many sort of, like, overlapping religious traditions in those countries.
I think, now you mentioned Shaman King, actually that's kind of wild, because I think what's really interesting
I heard Shaman King's really popular in Russia or something.
Oh, right, yeah, I think you mentioned that too. Because like when you're talking about this idea of like what does like the multicultural world look like, what's kind of interesting about Shaman King is that it kind of like has facets of that, has facets of like almost like the world in a sense, like on both like an international and also like a spiritual level. I mean, granted, like there are some things that you can critique about it, of course, but it's just like
Chocolate,
but it's kind of
Chocolate.
Chocolate, yeah, good old Chocolate, yeah, there's a lot you can say about him, but no, yeah, just like, but yeah, like Shaman King kind of makes steps towards that, like what like the world would look like, because even so, like, man, funnily enough, like even Tao Ren's arc with with the relationship with his family and trying to break out of like the cycle of violence, and it is almost much more like palpable and relatable in terms of like, I mean, yeah, like like Hiroyuki Takei's like Japanese, of course, and of course, like there are some like cultural images that's like bound in Tao Ren's characters, like the fact that their house is like not a house, they're like,
I mean, everyone in Shaman King is a ludicrous ethnic caricature, but it's kind of like, it just kind of owns that. Like,
yeah, but there's also just like a certain attention to detail in the way that, like, unlike say Sheung King's, like whenever characters are brought up, they're just like brought up in almost like a naked way, like giving no room for like introspection or anything like that. At least in Shaman King, you sort of have room for introspection. Well, maybe not introspection in terms of just like really delving into a character's interior, but more like in like almost like a wave, like going into like the character's interiority as well as their like exteriority and the kind of over the top things that are happening, like from like the battle scenes and just like the and just like how one like sees the world around them. It's like it all kind of like weaves into this really like interesting tapestry in a sense that kind of makes more steps towards like this project of the world more than most.
Well, Shaman King's interesting because it's grounded in that sort of like it's about like this shaman fight set in the year 2000, and it's grounded in that like turn of the millennium global sort of globalized imagination, like of the sort of like world music, and like I think Angie's talked about like that. I think might have come up on the 2000s episode, like that sort of like Discovery Kids aesthetic, that sort of like almost neoliberal sort of like global village utopianism, and Shaman King is of its time in that it's like a really sort of serious expression of that vision of multiculturalism, but it's also one that is extremely pointedly anti-capitalist and is probably grounded in sort of, in a sense, like the alter-mondialism, alter-globalization of the sort of anti-globalization movement. And like everyone is sort of a stereotype of their country because they're sort of like, or their spiritual tradition, because it's sort of like, on one hand, they are like presenting this to the world, but they're also presenting this as something that on some level deserves to be preserved against like the American melting pot neoliberalism. And they're fighting to preserve it in this new era. Like they're representing it at the Shaman fight on the world stage.
Right. Yeah. Actually, what's interesting then is that Shaman King kind of acts like an interesting metaphor through like this entire topic because like the main thing that I'm getting into into Sheung King's book and also Wayson Choi's book to a somewhat lesser extent is this idea of like self-orientalizing and to try and give the book its Chinese flavor or make it appeal to the Chinese market if we're going to or like Chinese diaspora market. And it's like and it sticks to that, whereas in like Shaman King it's like, yeah, you have these like almost like stereotypical caricatures, but they try to kind of like break out of that. I mean, even the fact that at the end, like it's just like how it becomes like the Shaman King, but he's also surrounded by almost all the competitors that fought like at the time is simply just like, oh man.
Yeah. Shaman King's really good, but again, we were going to talk about Turning Red, and which is the sort of big. I really wanted to watch Turning Red because it was attracting the most deranged. What? What did you say?
I gotta go to the bathroom, but keep talking.
Yeah, I wanted to watch Turning Red because it was attracting the most deranged anti-woke criticism I have ever seen. And people were just like nakedly looking for reasons to hate this movie, and nobody seemed to know why they hated it. Most of the people who hated it did not even seem to have seen it because I was assuming it would be in theaters, and I was hoping for it to be my first in theater movie viewing experience of since COVID, but Disney only released it on Disney Plus, where only their most loyal subscribers could actually see it. But everyone else posted about it anyway and was sharing the same 5 screenshots and being like, "Look how ugly this is," and it just looked like an animated kids book essentially, and people were trying to make some sort of cuties style moral panic about how it sexualizes children because it acknowledges that May is going through puberty and likes boys and draws horny fan art. And none of these things stuck, and people were sort of people were mocking these takes, but also nobody was stepping up to seriously defend the movie or say anything good about it. And so I was curious, what is, because it represents, I think, and the reason people were just automatically latching onto it, hating it, is in terms of the sort of just relatability and sort of surface level signifiers, the marketing stuff that everyone picks up on unconsciously. It is like a Tumblr movie. It is one of probably the biggest flagship yet of the sort of Tumblr animation generation that like first appeared on the scene with like Steven Universe, and then kind of like colonized a huge amount of the like Western 2D animation scene, doing these like kind of cutesy anime influenced, explicitly identity politics oriented stories like that are kind of similar to like what squeakcore is in literature. And like with squeakcore, like I'm weirdly sympathetic to it. Like I know I complained about squeakcore, but that's because I think it is something that failed to live up to its historical potential. And that's something I say as someone who was on Tumblr from like 2012 through 2015, when all of this sort of subculture was emerging. It was one of the first places on the internet I really felt like I fit in. I didn't entirely fit in. I didn't fit in as much as I do on the incredibly niche parts of Twitter I do now, but in serious ways, I don't feel like I fit in there either. It was the first time I was like, oh, it's like people who are weeaboos, but also like artistically ambitious and serious, and also like trying to work politics into what they're doing, and trying to correct sort of the like injustices of Western media tropes. Like, that's all really good. And some of the products of that culture, even though everyone came to hate that culture largely because, like, a mix of because it had, like, politics that actually made people uncomfortable, and it also had just some of, like, the nastiest people imaginable and worst social dynamics on the internet. Like, some of the art it's produced is pretty good. Steven Universe is honestly a pretty good show. Like, Homestuck was kind of predated that and got turned into that by its staff and kind of got worse as it turned into that, but like, a lot of the derivative work that's come out of it is pretty good. I can't really speak to Undertale. I haven't played it, but like I have a good impression of it. So yeah, I was curious what the sort of the Tumblr Pixar movie would be like. And particularly I had high hopes for it because I'm a fan of like the slice of life genre and the sort of like magical girls and the sort of just like cute, quiet, like everyday life focused anime and sort of like stories about like young girls' lives and stuff like that. And like I was hoping it would do something like that in a Western context, which I think would be a really good way of mediating the question of realism that that sort of Western art is bumping up against, of how do we represent the contemporary. And I'm like, I keep coming up against the question of like, well, how do you represent the contemporary in like a sort of cozy slice of life mode? Can you, like, would that potentially like revolutionize the way we look at the everyday around us? Would that give us like a more sort of optimistic way of looking at the world? Now, Turning Red is not exactly contemporary. It's also a nostalgia text, which like everything seems to be these days, and it's specifically 2000s nostalgia, which is something we've done a podcast about. But like, yeah, that was something we were. Keep going.
Well, just even with the 2000s, right? Like, thinking about it, I remember even watching, thinking like, there's nothing like remotely 2000s about Turning Red. It almost feels like it almost feels vacuous in the sense that there's no like center of what the 2000s is. Like if you like even watching it, I'm sure you've heard me complain, going like, this is not the 2000s. Like, this is 2002. Like, what I remember from 2002 was that Chinese girl in like Ontario that went missing, and there was like a province-wide like manhunt to try and find her.
Now, and now that like we say that, it's like I'm not sure how much of that is our perception of 2002. We're younger millennials. We were not the age of these characters in 2002. So we don't necessarily remember the really early 2000s that well anyway. And there is stuff that, like, afterwards, I'm like, okay, I didn't notice any particularly 2000s details throughout that. And then, like, I saw threads on Twitter of, like, you know the guy, I'm forgetting what his name is, like, the kind of annoying light-skinned guy? Like... Yeah, the antagonist who becomes their friend because he turns out he also likes the boy band. His entire outfit is like based on like the outfit like Nelly wore, like the R&B singer Nelly.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man. It's funny too because I remember like you probably even like heard me like because like one part that I was like, wow, like big Lamau moment was the fact that May's mom was super racist. Like, holy shit. I mean, granted, like that's kind of like a somewhat believable detail because there's a lot of like conservative Asians within like these diaspora spaces, so obviously they would.
Like, I wasn't even picking up on the racism. It's like subtle Asian racism that you like know how to read, so that's authentic, I gotta say. That counts to its authenticity points.
You know when like May was showing her mom the boy band Four Town, and then and her mom like, well, it didn't show her like directly pointing to this. Well, I mean, because Four Town is made up of like what, like a couple black guys and like a few like white or like,
yeah,
I guess
I think there might be like a Latino guy or something probably, but
even like biracial. But it's just funny because like the mom is like, oh, like these delinquents, like reads the same way of when like, you know, when people would like low key call people like call black people the N-word like in the most like police possible, and it's just like, wow, man, your mom really is racist. Like, then again, this is like a 2000s boy band, of course. Like, they're going to have their token, like, they're like, as Kanye West said, their token blackie. So
yeah, it's I think it's kind of but insofar as like the 2000s thing, it definitely, when we did our 2000s nostalgia podcast, it's like, when is the 2000s as a cultural construct going to start becoming something distinct from what it actually was? And like the way 80s nostalgia is associated with stuff like synthwave that doesn't sound anything like actual 80s music. And in a way, the movie's 2000s nostalgia did feel like that, at least in that it is, like, collapsing the entire decade into one thing. We noticed they're reading, like, a Twilight-type book, and, like, Twilight was not a thing until the end of the decade. Like... Yeah,
I think a lot of 2010's influence, that was for sure. Because, because the early 2000s, like, when I saw it, I was like, this didn't exist. What it looked more like was something like Life is Strange, trying to capture this 2010s nostalgia with like a bunch of references to shit from like the 80s and 90s, but like the 2000s, just literally nothing. Like, and the 2010s, it's just like, oh, and now we're gonna think about the past, except for it's all gonna be pastel and shit.
Yeah. I mean, I remember you noting also that like when she turns into the panda and then her friends are like, oh, we can like sell like photo ops with the panda to make money for the concert tickets. Like they were organizing this through cell phones, and it's like older cell phones clearly, but also like middle school kids did not even have cell phones. in 2002. Like,
I would have laughed at that shit. Like early 2000s. Nah, I used to have to play outside with sticks and stones. Like it was like some World War III shit. It's just like, oh fuck, what do we do? I don't know. Let's just hit each other with sticks and then start punching each other.
I mean, I knew kids who were on the internet. Like I knew kids who were probably on the internet really early because they were kind of nerdy kids. Like, I remember, like, one of my friends who was, like, the first guy I knew who got into 4chan, probably, was, like, homeschooled for a year and then told me he spent, he got sent back to school because he spent the entire year he was homeschooled just reading Wikipedia articles and playing Diablo.
Well, yeah, like the internet was always like a myth in a sense. Like you always like your time with it was always either like very like regimented, or you just heard it from a rumor. Like this one kid going like, "Hey guys, do you guys know what sex is?" Like kind of like that kind of like talk. Like
have
was
you guys
like where
seen Goatsy?
That's what they call it. Man, it's like, man, have you guys heard of the hit game Squid Game?
Yeah, most of that shit, like, even the like old internet stuff I'm thinking of, like, I didn't encounter until the mid to late 2000s, like 2006, like the 2002, like, this movie is set before 4chan. Like, this movie is set before Moot left Something Awful. Not that that's like a reference that any of these characters would have had, and it's not like they seem to be particularly online or anything. There's no real like internet sort of. There's no 2000s internet culture in this movie, I don't think.
No, there isn't. I mean,
there's like
the
fandom,
internet culture and stuff like in jokes. You know that part where she's like snapping her fingers in front of her face, like doing that kind of like sort of, well, marketing wise, like a girly rebuke, like snapping her fingers in front of her face when she's like, that's like a very like late 2000s 2010s thing, like, and it's really obvious there because people are like, ah ha ha, super funny. Like, I mean, it's almost the equivalent of just like 20 years from now, like we'd just be watching movies with our kids, and then all of a sudden you just see like, it's like, hey, have you heard of the hit game Among Us? And we'd just be like, no.
Putting Among Us in like a movie set in like 2018.
Yeah, basically, like they won't even drop it subtly, like, when it was actually funny. Like when people like, Kanye West skit for it's like I call this private meeting today because there is an imposter among us. No, it's like, guys, there's an imposter among us, and a fucking zoom in when he says among us, and everyone goes like.
But yeah,
make a friend here, like meme instead.
Anyway, it didn't quite scratch my sort of slice of life itch because it does not give itself the time to dwell on the mundane that Asian media that does that does. Which is, again, similar to what we were saying about Sheung and Wong Kar-wai, like that even though that book, like, nothing happens in, like, it also doesn't sort of give itself the time to sit with things that, like, Wong Kar-wai does. So it's kind of in, like, manic, like, Nickelodeon cartoon mode for most of it, but it does have some really sweet moments with her friends and stuff. Like, the emotional arcs are well-defined.
Yeah, I was gonna say, actually, yeah, like as much as I meme on, like, Turning Red, like, I don't, like, I don't doubt their intentions at all. Like, there are parts of it that captured the kind of repression that Asian diaspora, like, children have felt, like, whenever they presented themselves in, like, in school or at home. Like, even in Sheung King's book, there's, like, a similar kind of drive to realize it, and admittedly, in Turning Red, it hits it a lot stronger. Like, there are parts where I was just like, damn, shit, like, like that kind of hit. Like the parts where just like basically just like May is just in her room while her parents are arguing, or not arguing, but rather like basically like your mom's like, oh, it's gonna be okay, whatever, and then it's just like oh, it's a disaster, like just like of course like the parents don't know they're being heard, but like May hears it.
I mean, I think that like opening dream-like scene where she just like where her mom goes and like humiliates her at the corner store, where she's been drawing the like young lean looking guy at the corners. Oh yeah, that actually felt anachronistic. Like the sort of hot emo loser guy wears like a young lean bucket hat. Like
fucking Young Lean in 2000s, bro. I found Young Lean. Nah. People in 2000s. I remember reading this Reddit thread actually.
I mean, bucket hats actually were bucket hats a thing. Actually, is the bucket hat fashion thing a 2000s nostalgia thing in the first place? Because now that I think of it, I'm like, again, I wasn't paying enough attention to fashion then, but.
Now, I was just gonna say, like, I thought people in the 2000s like had their boy crushes with like Inuyasha or like Atherin Zala or like Kirei Yamato from Gundam Seed, because like people like when they were talking about the Gundam Seed redub, they were literally like full out admitting like, yeah, like Atherin Zala, like that was my sexual awakening. I was just like, whoa, damn, yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think they're trying to make her they're trying to make her more normie. She draws anime style, but she's not into 2D guys. Like, she's into boy bands and, like, local boys.
Real person. Am I right, guys? Man. Fucking... That's so funny. I can't believe Disney won't even acknowledge that there are people that are into 2D, like,
Well, again, that's where it's like... It felt like the movie didn't give people a lot of time to develop really individual sort of personality quirks, or like each of her friends had kind of like one personality note. Like, I liked how just the one friend is just like really deadpan when she talks all the time.
Yeah.
And then there's
well, actually, she had some like dialogue, I guess. Like, but yeah, they are mostly like one note. I think the only person that had much significance was either that one friend that was like vaguely Asian, that other vaguely Asian friend, I don't remember what her name is, and Miriam, but that's because Miriam was like plot.
Yeah.
And fucking like man, that fucking subtext is super hilarious. That her mom is like, I can't believe you corrupted her in the same way as like, oh, these white people, they're corrupting my pure Asian family. I can't believe it. These colonizers, these white people.
I mean, that is what the subtext is supposed to be. Like, that.
Yeah, I know, but it's just so like it's not even an in-your-face kind of subtext, but it's almost like, haha, I can't believe they went there. Like, her mom is like straight up racist, yeah, but it's just like, yeah, they went there for both sides. So her mom's like not even just racist towards like black people, but she's also just racist towards like white people too.
Yeah. Well, the narrative. Let's dig into the sort of narrative of like sexual corruption a bit, because that's an interesting one where like the sort of the cultural corruption is identified with sexual corruption, and that seems to be like a big part of her mother's neurosis, is that like America is why her daughter's hitting puberty. Like or Canada in this case is why her daughter's hitting puberty, and like she wouldn't be getting horny for random guys if she wasn't in this like hypersexualized culture, and like obviously on some level, and that's also the narrative that a lot of critics of the movie were picking up, where it's like, oh, because she draws this guy shirtless as a mermaid in her notebook. Like, this must be, like, Disney sexualizing children and telling 13-year-olds that it's okay to be horny, which, like, again, 13-year-olds are going to be horny. Like, that, but
I mean, there's... Anyway, like, even if you said it's okay, like, they're just going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Like...
And there's the bizarre, and, like, but her mom, like, actually imagines it's this, like, flat-out child grooming situation. Like, she assumes that the 17-year-old, like, cashier boy must have been having some sort of, like, pedophilic relationship with their daughter because
like some NTR mind break, like metamorphosis shit.
Here's where it gets really weird, is that, like, I was expecting to completely, like, laugh off this reading, but because it's about the way her parents conflate these things and it builds this into the metaphor, it actually kind of, like, it kind of ends up almost endorsing this reading, because, like, it's not at all clear what the panda metaphor is. Like, what the fuck is the panda? Like, it's never really explained. Like, on one hand, it's like this heritage, this, like, inheritance of her ancestors that seems to be part of her, like, traditional Chinese spirituality, but it's also something her, like, traditional family wants her to repress, and it's something that she, on the other hand, wants to sort of live out and live fully, and the only explanation that's ever given is it's, like, the beast within, it's, like, it's your id, basically. It's, like, I guess that as a sort of Freudian reading is the most straightforward reading of it. That actually, now that I think of it, the film is almost straightforwardly Freudian, where, like, the panda is the id, and, like, the traditional culture is, like, extremely superego driven. It's a maternal superego rather than a paternal superego, but, like, it just wants you to completely repress your id, and live under the familial superego in the name of filial piety, but when you're a teenager, your id's going to be really strong, and you're going to come into conflict with your family and others because of that. But Western society, because it has this consumer side, kind of encourages you to embrace your id to a certain extent, because your id will drive you to spend money on shit like boy bands and, like, get wild, go crazy, go out to clubs, like, go out to house parties, like. But the confusing thing is, like, because the expression of the id is so much tied to her age and to her sexuality and puberty, which, like, her sexuality is shown really explicitly at the beginning of the movie when she's, like, drawing the boys and stuff, but then almost completely disappears as soon as the panda enters the picture. There's sort of a sense that the panda seems to be itself a puberty metaphor. So then you get this awkward thing. Get this awkward thing where, like, the first thing she does as soon as she figures out she can, to some extent, control turning into the panda is start, like, making money off it and, like, selling, like, again, these photo ops with the panda and, like, going to parties and, like, turning into the panda and letting people, like, cuddle and play with her and giving people rides and shit. And if you're still treating it as a puberty metaphor, it's like, wait, what the fuck is going on here? Is she letting boys touch her for money? Is she making an OnlyFans underage? It feels like sex trafficking. It feels like her friends are fucking trafficking her to get boy band tickets. Like, it actually feels like the plot of Cuties. It's like Cuties is the more honest version of this movie because, again, Cuties represents, like, the sort of, like, id-driven Western society that sort of exploits teenagers' sexuality and id to make money is actually dangerous to teenagers. And that doesn't mean that the, like, super ego driven, like, sort of traditional family structure is necessarily any better, but, like, it's also not completely random and irrational that her mom has these fears that, like, someone's gonna take advantage of her. And Cuties is, again, I haven't actually seen Cuties, but, like, my impression of what that movie was about from people who actually watched it was it's about how, like, immigrant teenagers are actually stuck between, particularly teenage girls are actually stuck between a rock and a hard place in relation to these kinds of things. Now, in terms of, like, May doesn't seem to actually do anything that risky besides going out to a boy band concert. So she really, like...
Party. Like, wasn't that, like, a big thing?
Yeah, she went to a house party, but then it's, like, a house party where they're just drinking, like, Grape Crush or something. Actually, I saw a bunch of people making memes of it being lean.
Oh man, like, it's treated the same way of, like, oh, my 18-year-old daughter is actually going to go to a party with boys who are hormonal? Like,
yeah.
Oh, like, actually, but on the point that you brought up, yeah, like, I even mentioned, when we were watching it, we were even, like, talking about, like, what's kind of odd about, like, Turning Red, unlike, say, Sheung King's book, is that the Asianness, like, yeah, it's a distinctly Asian movie, like, in terms of, like, the culture that it's representing, but it's not specific in terms of, like, what group of, like, Asian or, like, Chinese for that matter. Like, unlike, say, Mulan, like, where, like, Mulan literally refers to her mom and dad as, like, oh, mama, papa, like, you know, in Cantonese. In Turning Red, like,
wait, I didn't realize Mulan is Cantonese. That's actually really weird because, like, you'd think it would be, like, Northern Chinese more so,
yeah,
given...
What's super funny about it, and that's just, that's, like, one of the examples, just, like, you know, inserting, like, your like I guess in that instance, like, Cantonese, like, smoothly in an English movie, but anyway, besides that, yeah, like, what was interesting about Turning Red was the fact that the kind of old country and the old culture was, like, vague. Even though it was vague, like, at the very least, it wasn't, like, trying to, like, beat you over the head with, like, the old country. But by the same token, the whole thing with raising money for the boy band is, like, yeah, no, it's like, yeah, it's cool that they're not, like, exploiting, the basically the old country within the film, but then she exploits, you know, her turning into a panda for money, like, exploiting her, like, you know, cultural, like, symbol, or, like, you know, it's related to be, like, for money, like,
she's exploiting something, and it's not clear what it is, because it's not clear what the panda's a metaphor for, and the panda's also, like, not an actual mythological thing. It's not like Sheung King, like, referencing every old saying and myth in the book. Like, they completely made up a spiritual tradition to fit into this metaphor. Like... But
man,
yeah, and it's a thing that, again, like, being a panda, like, it's almost like it's a red panda. It's not, like, the most obvious possible panda. It's not like the panda that you would use in a political cartoon of China. But, like, when, like, okay, spoilers for the end, like, her mom goes into her panda form, which is, like, a fucking kaiju panda. And, like, rampages onto, like, the boy band concert, and, like, to get her, and that's like, oh, that feels like, that looks like an Economist political cartoon. Like, when you just look at that scene, like, out of context, it's like a giant rampaging symbol of China attacking, like, a sort of gathering of Western mass consumer culture. And it's like, it's literally the core conflict the film is about, is about, like, Chinese traditional culture versus, or like a very weird version of Chinese traditional culture versus Western consumer culture, which is what Disney is. And like, I'm surprised, given the sort of the attempt to sort of simultaneously be this big sort of like progressive representation moment, it's willing to go that sort of nakedly assimilationist. And again, the panda is sort of useful there because, like, the thing she's repressing is also sort of a symbol of her culture. But it's a symbol of her culture that she figures out how to, as you were just saying, literally sell and make money off of, like writing your story about your childhood and selling it to Disney and turning it into part of the Western culture industry. And that's like that's her sort of triumph over her parents, who want to keep that as, like, hermetically sealed and separate from her life in the new country as possible, to sort of, like, assimilate by just, like, not drawing attention to themselves and not drawing attention to the fact that they're Chinese. And then she's like, no, I can make money off the fact that I'm Chinese because, like, we're progressive now and into diversity. So I think that's another interpretation of what's going on there.
The mom and dad, I find,
but her panda's also smaller. Like, her panda's not an insane, like, rampaging kaiju like her mom's. So once again, like, the ambiguity of the metaphor kind of shoots itself in the foot, where, like, your Chinese heritage is sort of something you need to, like, control because it's also your id, but it's like the repression of the id is also the sort of, and I guess, like, the thing is, like, the repression, I think that's, I guess, sort of like an extension of the particular diaspora experience it's responding to, where, like, the traditional sort of culture and the repression of the traditional culture are coming from the same superego position. Like, her parents are telling her, like, on one hand, like, be good, stay home, do filial piety, keep these traditions at the temple in private, but also, like, out in the world, like, be Canadian, assimilate, like, don't stick out, don't talk about things that would set you apart from others. And so there's a weird thing where, like, I think sort of the Western, the extent to which it sort of, like, actually makes a case for Western soft power is that, like, assimilating in this sort of multicultural way actually gives you the chance to assimilate in a way that the sort of traditional keeping your head down assimilation wouldn't. And I do think, like, insofar as it's propaganda for the West, it's not the worst. It's not propaganda I find incredibly objectionable. I feel like one of the few W's for the West, and one of the reasons I'm not willing to fully, like, embrace the new, like, CCP world order the way somebody like Logo does, is like the extent to which we're willing to imagine a less authoritarian parenting structure. Like, I do like, insofar as, like, if the West has anything to offer now, it's that. And, like, it has literally nothing else to offer than that, but that is still something, and the fact that a movie like this even exists is proof that it is still something. But...
Right. Because even then, like, in the culture, too, right? Like, there's also that reactionary, like sort of, dip into, like, being authoritarian, because it's like, oh, it's the only thing we can do. Like, oh, it's like, we have no choice, kind of thing.
Yeah. But on the other hand, like, it is a Disney movie, and it's identifying the sort of... It identifies the less authoritarian sort of structure with, like, well, what is your sort of... What is your real self? What do you really want to do? What is your true will? And, like, it can't really show you anything other than buy boy band tickets. Like, and on that level, I don't think it makes that case the most convincingly, because absolutely there are going to be, like, trads who will justifiably look at this film and be like, you'd trade, like, all the ancient Chinese poetry and the Confucian classics for fucking Four Town. Like, and...
Man, we really are at war with boy bands, with traditions, but most of all, we're at war with ourselves.
And that's where I find the slice of life sort of anime, like, analogy is interesting, because I feel like the best sort of defense of, like, the kind of liberal values, like Western sort of values I've ever seen, insofar as, like, that kind of relatively unconstrained everyday life. And, like, and even the certain levels of consumerism that sort of undergird it, have been from, like, Japanese slice of life shows. And on a certain level, it feels like the sort of problem of it being, like, Western dominated kind of solves itself there. Like, the West has fallen behind the dialectic in conceiving of the very sort of good life that that for a moment, that at moments, at its best moments, it has been able to visualize. And by best moments here, I guess I'm sort of drawing a line on some level between, like, the Enlightenment and the New Left, and, like, in sort of the way the Frankfurt School does. Like, the West no longer does own that concept. It has, like, a certain legacy of it that it doesn't really even understand. That just sort of hangs on as an empty form in, like, in capitalism, in Disney selling you the idea of, like, a certain kind of liberation through boy bands and fan art, and even that's, like, parasitizing off black culture. Like Four Town is taking most of its sort of musical, like, liberation from hip hop, but, like, their whatever their producer and owners are not black people. Like,
what's it? Yeah, or to extend the metaphor of not just like of not just like these empty signifiers that kind of feedback and loop on themselves, and just reselling you, like, you know, yeah, like fan art and boy bands. I mean, for publishers, it's just basically packaging and reselling this idea of cultural nostalgia back to its audience.
Yeah.
Actually, one thing I do want to, like, jump back on really quickly was because I just remembered this before even like going on the podcast was like one time I was out with one of my boys, right, and he was telling me about a shift over at his job, and there was this guy who was just like was looking for some product that he wanted like my boy to find, and like in the meanwhile like, he would just had like pictures of like tits and ass or whatever straight up on the screen. But then like after he offered him a bag, he's like, no, I want that bag because that bag looks like a woman made it or something, and like I'm making an obviously like sexist remark, and like that outward kind of racism and discrimination, like the first thing that my boy like thought in his head was, this is extremely cringe. Like it's horrifying and like to actually like hear in public, but the immediate thing is the fact that the then compounded thing is, this is straight up like being cringe. Like this is like straight up just kind of stupid. Like
that's the thing I see whenever like one of those viral videos of like a Karen goes around of like some white lady freaking out at like black people, and like she's getting, and like the guys, whoever's filming is like, lady, don't you know we're filming this? You can go viral. Like you're.
What was it called? Or like the filthy French joke where it's like, and the guy was gonna say world star, he couldn't even say it. Instead, he was like, "The fuck is wrong with you?" But no, yeah, like, and the thing is that encountering like those like microaggressions within like Sheung King's book, for example, or even just like encountering microaggressions whenever they're written, it's almost written as this like almost cartoonishly like cringe moment, like, and like, yeah, it gets the emotion like, yeah, this is horrifying, but now it's just like, it's more like, this is super cringe, like in the same way that back in the day, back in the gang weed era, we had like, pop culture icons with like shitty mics saying like the N-word and whatever, and essentially like the whole joke of it, despite like the inherent problems of it, is the joke is that it's supposed to be cringe and stupid. Like it's not supposed to be like, it's supposed to be kind of like, what's it called, like a parody of like people who go like, oh, like everything's so woke, there's no such thing as free speech anymore, and it's just like these same people are just like they just say like a million like racial epithets at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think what I guess I want to ask then is just like, I wonder how like the conversation about like racism and basically like discrimination being like almost like reflexively cringe in the way that, one, it's experienced, and two, like, like, remember one time we went out, right? We went to like an airsoft store. Like, you might know where this is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, and I was joking around, going like, man, if only this wasn't Canada, then I'd get these airsoft guns for a lot cheaper. And I was like, joking around, and then a guy just like off to the side just says like something like, but this country, like, this isn't Canada. Canada doesn't own this country. It's owned by the people who make all the products here. And then I'm just like, okay. Like, the joke just completely just like eluded me. And then when we go out and I ask you like, hey, like, what country was he referring to? And then you're like, he was referring to China. I was like, and it's just like extremely like, what would you say? Like, yeah, it's like, it's both cringe, but it's just like, what a completely like, what's it called? Like, it's like unfun, like almost like unfunny, like ratio, like get good, like that kind of tweet. Like, man, it's almost as bad as like. Do you remember the movie Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood?
Yes.
Yeah, because people are like, I know the whole argument about it. Like, it's like, yeah, it's an okay movie. Like, it has like a coherent like arc and whatever. But I think people are conflating it so bad because it's like, oh, it's so anti-PC. Like, see, even a racist person can be a good guy or whatever. And it's just like, bruh, what is this, like The Last of Us? Like, yeah, there are bad people. Yeah, we know. Yeah, there are racist people that are kind of like that have like human qualities. Yeah, we know. But yeah, it's like that degree where it's just like every time like he's just saying like some like, of course like being like racist in kind of like like bro-y like manly way. It's just like
I mean, he's also like being a like standard Clint Eastwood badass at the same time. So it's like he's kind of a ridiculously romanticized version of that sort of like white disgruntled vet in the first place. But like,
maybe. but just said like, was just like, man, like
there's that scene where he like scares off a bunch of black gangsters. That's almost like straight up Pole fan service, and he's just like, and pull up your pants, like kind of thing. Like,
it's that shit where it's like, where it's like the guy's walking, and then the guy goes like. It's like, yo, Greco, what are you up to? It's like, nothing. It's like, oh, no worries, partner. You all right? And he's like, yeah. It's like, cool, peace. And then he goes like home, and he's like, I saw this I saw this black dude, and I told him, fuck up, man. It's like, it's just, yeah, you know that.
Yeah, it's that comic. Anyway, off the topic, we're getting off topic again. I feel like the sort of question of like explicit versus implicit racism is a good segue to, and I guess like we should be wrapping it up soon. This is going pretty late, but like fortunately I don't have all that much to say about Wayson Choi's Jade Peony, which is about like a period when this sort of like when like the explicit racism was a lot more explicit. And, like, you don't have that sort of weird Sheung King sort of problem of, like, writing in these, like, cringe microaggressions and then having to make them feel really dramatic. Like, you had, like, much more explicit sort of racism that people, that like, Canada was still, like, restricting Chinese immigration at the time. And, like, the Chinese people in Vancouver, like, really feel like they are not Canadian, but also, like, they can't be fully Chinese. And, like, the sort of, the assimilation debate is, like, way starker, where it's like the kids feel flat out ashamed to be Chinese, and it's not just like, oh, I want to do like X or Y thing, like go out to see a boy band, but my parents won't let me. It's like, oh, like, don't you know all these like rituals and stuff you're doing are unscientific superstition? And like, because we learned that at school, and at school they're like drilling you to be like essentially a British military regiment. Actually, even then there were lines that I'm like, this can't possibly be realistic. I'm not like, I mean, one, I'm not Asian enough, but then like also Wayson Choi is like a couple of generations removed from when any of this would have happened anyway, so it's not clear how realistic the dialogue could be. But there's lines like, okay, I agree, Father, Kiam began. You must realize that this Mandarin only confuses us. We are Cantonese speakers. They're talking about going to like a Chinese school which is teaching Mandarin, which is an interesting dynamic where like it's got lots of like little micro dynamics like this. It's well. And you do not complain about Latin, French, or German in your English school? Father rattled his newspaper, a signal that his patience was ending. But Father, those languages are scientific. Kiam jabbed his brush in the air for emphasis. We are now in a scientific, logical world. Like...
Man, owning my Chinese family with facts and logic!
Yeah.
Man, yeah, the same facts and logic that completely destroyed those other nations. Like, yeah, okay, facts and logic, guys.
Yeah, it's like that seems like a level of like I'm not even sure by what ideological framework at the time like those certain languages would have been defined as scientific over others, or if anybody other than like the most caricatural racists would have believed that, but right. I might be, I haven't done, like, Wayson Choi did a whole bunch of research for this, so, like, maybe that's...
Yeah. Well, a couple things I want to say is just, well, it's kind of ironic that they find Mandarin more confusing than Cantonese, because usually people find that the other way around. That's why you have, like, white YouTubers learn Mandarin and shit to pick up, like...
they're just, it's just that they're native Cantonese speakers. So, like, there's this beginning nationalist project where, like, both the nationalists and the communists are trying to unite China against Japan while this is happening, and the Chinese community in Vancouver is also trying to sort of, like, define its own identity as a diaspora community, despite everyone being from different areas and having different dialects. And so Mandarin is starting to emerge as the sort of, like, consensus national language, despite, like, this family being native Cantonese speakers.
Right, yeah, because, like, the other thing, too, is that, well, this scene, and I guess to another extent Sheung King's book, actually shows, like, a much more, like, naked form of trauma, in the sense of, in the same way that Alice Florida shows the drunks, like, shows the trauma of, like, a painful kind of masculinity. In here, it's just like this painful kind of, well, I mean, I guess the meme word would be like, brainwashing per se, or brainworms, but more like a traumatic kind of portrait of, like, a child who's being socialized in and, like, educated in these, like, in these kind of, like, oppressive kind of structures, being put at odds with their own culture and viewing their own culture with shame. Yeah. Whereas with Sheung King's book, it's like a form of trauma, of, like, a frustration of a kind of language and expression in a sense. Albeit that's as much, like, as I'll give towards, like, Sheung King, because considering how the rest of the book goes. But there is that kind of, like, that kind of, like, stark kind of, like, violence that's very, like, very sudden. Like, when you read me that scene, I was like, I was like, oh shit, kind of thing.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there's lots of stark violence in this book, and that's, like, it's a world where just, like, violence is way more immediately part of people's lives than it is now. Like, in every dimension, from, like, not just the racial, but, like, it's during a war, like, the kids are playing war games constantly where they're just, like, nobody has video games or anything yet. They're just, like, LARPing as soldiers, like, imagining massacring Japanese, and, like, they have, like, a game where, like, they flick matches onto newspaper and pretend they're doing bombing raids, and, like, parents are obviously way more willing to actually hit their children, and teachers also do that, and, like, all sorts of shit. Like, the one of the kids gets involved in, like, a sort of boxing rate. Like, all the kids have, like, physical fights regular, except the girl. Like, one of the kids gets involved in this sort of boxing thing to sort of prove his masculinity. He's, like, the gay one, and ends up falling in love with this older boxer guy who becomes a soldier. You get the picture.
Actually, one thing that I will say, that as much as I say that, like, yeah, this is a very, like, stark portrait of trauma, at the same time, like, it's still a bit easy to, like, to meme, in a sense. Like, I mean, Alice Florida's Shoe is the same kind of way, just because it would just be, like, in the scene where he's like killing those homeless guys, and he goes, "Hasta la vista, baby." Like, it's supposed to be, like, a kind of showing of trauma mediation, but on the other side of things, it's like, yeah, this is kind of silly and kind of a meme. Like, just, like, this guy imagining him, like, you know, killing other people as if he's, like, an action hero. Whereas in here, it's, like, same kind of, like, tension is at play in terms of, like, the way that it's represented. Just, like, oh, but, like, it's unscientific. Like, that's, like, that really, like, that does sound a little bit like a meme. Like, you know, all things considered.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a struggle to even imagine or represent that level of naked violence as opposed to the sort of abstracted violence we primarily talk about and deal with in a lot of our own work and on this show. Although one interesting thing about it in relation to that is that, and one thing I wanted to touch on about it, in relation to our discussion so far is that, like, particularly it is a wartime novel, and a lot of the racism in it, like, there's the sort of, like, default patronizing sort of, like, Western culture is more scientific and progressive sort of racism, which even, like, not just the kids sort of embrace, but even, like, the like, mid-generation Chinese people, like, their immediate parents to a certain extent, where they're, like, they're nationalists, but they want to become, like, modernizing nationalists. But, like, a lot of the most extreme racism is wartime racism, and it's actually, like, primarily against, like, the Japanese, and the white people and the Chinese are actually sort of on the same side against the Japanese in that context. And the last story, the one I hadn't got to last time I talked to you about this book, is, like, one of the kids sort of witnessing this, like, Romeo-Juliet kind of relationship between, like, a Chinese girl and a Japanese boy, and ends with, like, the Japanese boy and basically everyone else in Little Tokyo getting sent off to the Japanese internment camps. And, like, that level of the wartime racism, and at the same time, like, some of it rebounds on, like, on the Chinese, like, they wear, like, pins that say, like, I am Chinese, so people don't think they're Japanese, and stuff.
Right.
Like,
yeah, Sean has told me, like, similar stories where, like, there used to be a thing that where, like, kids used to make fun of her when she was in, like, in Canada, like, in university, where they say, like, Chinese, Japanese, money, please, and they would just, like, make their eyes pop. Yeah,
I remember a version of that where it was, like, where people would, like, pull up their, like, the corner of their eyes. I don't even remember which one is which, actually, but, like, pull up and down. It's like, my mom was Chinese, my dad was Japanese, I'm a bit of both. Like,
what does that even? Wait, so what was the punchline?
It's like,
so, like,
it's the eyes being slanted in different directions. Like,
oh, nah.
I don't even remember which direction is supposed to be which. Like,
man. Can you imagine, like, looking at, you know, those, like, not even, like pre-world music, like, you know, whenever, like, in, like, schools and stuff, they draw, like, caricatures of, like, everyone from around the world.
Yeah.
Asian people, and they just look like
I mean,
rock.
I had books like that when I was a kid. I had some, like, really... I remember having some really weirdly illustrated, like, picture book of some Chinese fairy tale, and it was, like, one of the... Like, they were drawn in just some incredibly, like, weird-looking way, and I remember it being, like, both uncomfortable and fascinating to look at. Like, not even on a, like, I'm understanding the racial dynamic so much as, like, this is a really weird way to draw. Like...
Man, like, where are the eyes at, man?
But yeah,
like,
the wartime racism thing I wanted to bring up because, like, the major sort of theme that's been emerging over the course of this entire podcast is that, like, on some level, like, when representing sort of racialized othering, like, there's this sort of impulse to, again, do the, like, story about a microaggression and have this kind of explicit racism that doesn't seem to hold the same power anymore, and the stuff that, like, I've witnessed you react to really strongly is the more subtle kind of thing that comes, like, that where you're expected to fit into a certain sort of role or narrative, as much by sort of progressive culture as by, like, the chuds. and where like the turning red thing where you're sort of expected to like sell your identity in particular ways to assimilate, but the like there's also a sense in which, given like the sort of intensification of multipolar global tensions, it does feel like shit could flip back to like wartime racism, like weirdly on a dime, like witnessing the sort of the reaction against like everything Russian right now. And it's like everyone's sort of shocked, like, wait, we still do this? Like fucking getting rid of like an astronaut like event named after Yuri Gagarin, like canceling a Netflix adaptation of a Tolstoy book, like all this bizarre,
like breaking their Japanese made automobiles back in the 80s, like. Yeah, like I think the main thing too is that now like much of that like discrimination is almost like abstract, but having those like almost feels archaic, like in the sense of like like as you said, like we still do this because like most of like if you want to talk about like Chinese like discrimination, like just look at things like like the social credit meme or the Sheena meme or something.
Yeah.
Or even just like the whole like narrative about like whenever people talk about China, like the way that the algorithm kind of creates this kind of like well, I mean, granted, it's for geopolitical reasons as well as the fact that that's kind of what shapes like a lot of like of course like if you're in school, like obviously like no one's gonna like not, like the chance of someone like bringing this up to your fucking face is kind of like low medium, but like but it's just that it's an ever-present tension in the same way of like Denpa's like the radio waves in the sense like it's a constant like threat of violence is kind of looming over, but just that of course it's so nebulous. Like how can someone like really fight back? Like even for example like school shooters and like atrocity perpetrators, like it's like they're fighting back towards some kind of nebulous like kind
big
of oppression. But of course, it's like it ends in the same way like those things always do, where it's just like they kill a couple people and then they either like and then just like wander around aimlessly until like the SWAT or the PTU come and surround them. Basically.
January 6th. I mean, actually, now that like you're going to the shooters, but I'm also thinking now of, since you use that image of just sort of wandering around aimlessly, I'm like, January 6th and the trucker protests were essentially that. Like, you just, like, go into a building, you just, like, occupy a space somewhere where you get cameras on you, and then just wander around and wait to get removed by the cops. Like...
Yeah, like, actually, one scene that's quite prevalent is the Columbine movie Elephant by, Gus Van Sant. Like, I think one of the more prevalent scenes, other than the fact that it portrays, like, a school shooting in almost the most, like, muted way possible, and that, like, and that, like, there's no shock or anything. It's just, like, it almost feels more authentic in the fact that it feels so clumsily put together. And, like, and there's even just long takes of just, like, a guy just walking around an empty school, like, while the shooting is going on.
Yeah.
But essentially, so much of this like discrimination and violence is like almost like invisible in that sense. It's hard to really like push back against, which is kind of, for some, if when someone sees like something like maybe turning red or just like a push towards more progressive politics, kind of like something clicking where it's like this. Not even that it doesn't feel right, but it's just that it feels almost futile in a sense.
This wartime context where it does flip over into being visible just really suddenly. And that's when it happens like at the level of institutions. I feel like a lot of the sort of a lot of the scares about racism, like throughout the Trump era, was the idea that like that decentralized individual that are like individual racist, like radical outsider chuds are going to be like mobilized, and like obviously there were a bunch of mass shootings, but it was nowhere near the level of like I remember people on Twitter saying like there were going to be like door-to-door Rwanda style pogroms during the 2020 election. It's like no, that like none of those guys were that mobilized. But then when you have stuff like a wartime context where like individuals who are sort of driven to violence by extremist radicalization are largely kind of cowards when it comes to it. But like when you have this wartime situation where the Overton window of what it's acceptable for institutions to do in public just changes really rapidly, that's where I feel like shit gets scary in terms of in terms of a sort of return to overt discrimination. And I feel like the sort of like the scares about like sort of like random street attacks on Asian people or whatever early in COVID, like the like way more pertinent thing to be worrying about is like
the crime has now become like become public in a sense. It's become like the crime has become daily life. Like the crime is like discrimination, and crime was almost always, like at least before, like a secret act. But but then by wartime, it's like it slowly leaks out and it becomes like a public display, a public performance. No matter like how veiled it could be. Like wasn't there someone's account of like Nazi Germany where it's like it almost feels like when they walked out of it, it almost felt like they were walking through some kind of like sanitized version of a every day of Germany in a sense. Like wasn't there an account like that? I'm not
sure, but that sounds like something that would exist. I mean, that was what the Nazis really tried to enforce.
Yeah, like in the sense that like essentially the crime being so blatant that like now it just like completely transcends the crime. Like you don't even see people get like taken away anymore.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of like that. I guess in some sense, like the logical conclusion of where where they were taking this, and so in wartime, it's heading towards that logical conclusion where it's like to the point where like straight up like Japanese people don't even exist anymore in that like they would just all be like taken to the internment camps, which they were.
Yeah. So yeah, I do worry about what happens and I feel like the liberal sort of establishment that is simultaneously making movies like Turning Red and then also doing this we can't drink vodka anymore shit is not putting enough thought into what happens if tensions intensify with China. Some level, and if the sort of soft power conflict expressed in something like Turning Red and ultimately expressed in, I think, a lot of diaspora literature where the diaspora is sort of, again, opposed to the home country, is what if that soft power conflict flips over into a hard power conflict? And hopefully not a really hard power conflict, because if it's a really hard power conflict, we're all just getting fucking nuked. But,
Miami 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like I've mentioned Hotline Miami, countless times, but no, yeah, Hotline Miami is a pretty interesting, look at that idea of, the soft power going into the hard power, essentially because, the entire game is about hard power. Sort of floating in soft power before it just escalates towards the ultimate hard power, and that is a nuclear a nuclear holocaust that basically destroys both like the U.S. and Russia, but just that in the but you're basically playing like the sort of liminal space between like and what does that world look like? It looks like this colorful void that's of just endless violence in a sense, hyper violence.
Anyway, I should probably talk more about Jade Peony before we end this, but I kind of want to end it on this, and I don't actually have that much to say about Jade Peony, even though it's kind of the most standard Diaspora book we have on here, like the major representative of the sort of like Amy Tan tradition. Again, I guess like it's well written. It's got a lot of just like interesting social and character detail. It's got way more texture than something like Turning Red, or probably than I Am Eating an Orange. You were eating an orange. You were naked. But it's also got like just kind of heavy-handed stories and kind of predictable like. Okay, like, how would I represent, like, the discrimination against Japanese people? I'll have, like, a forbidden love between a Chinese character and a Japanese character. How will I represent that people were kind of homophobic in the 1930s, but, like, gay people still existed? I think the most interesting chapter to me is the one, the most kind of quiet one, which is the one from the perspective of a female character, and who's probably in some ways, Zhuge Liang is like simultaneously like the least internalized racist, but also like the least sort of fitting in with her own culture, because like on one hand, like she doesn't have as a girl like the same avenues for assimilation as the guys do, where like the guys can go into the army and can like become like middle class businessmen and want to sort of like assimilate into the middle class through their studies and through learning English and all this. And it's like she doesn't really have any prospects other than marriage, and she's almost certainly going to get married to a Chinese person. So, like, she doesn't have the temptation of assimilation in the same way, but she also does not have, like, any, like, she's also more primarily oppressed by her home culture, which is just, like, extremely sexist, and, like, I'm not pronouncing that right, like, the grandmother who, like, sort of spoils the sons and is this, like, this sort of benevolent figure in, like, Seklung's story, where, like, she comes back as a ghost and sort of watches over him, and he sort of gets the family to respect the traditions by, like, doing her sort of, like, memorial rites, she just treats the daughter like absolute shit, and it's like, you're just, like, useless because you're a girl, and the one person she fits in with, and she sort of, like, she's drawn to Western culture just through, like, movies and wanting to, like, look like Shirley Temple, like, but then she just sort of, like, has this, like, she's just really close with this weird old, like, great uncle guy who is somehow deformed. It's not really explained how, and looks like the Monkey King.
That's where that comes from.
Yeah. And it's just like he's the only person who just lets her be a kid and lets her copy dances from Shirley Temple in the movies and gets her nice clothes, and then he has to go back to the old country to take Bones back. Like, and then she just sort of disappears, and it's like, I'm really curious what happened to her. She is by far the most interesting character to me. But, like, and also poses sort of like the most interesting problem for the book in a way where, again, like, she's not faced by the sort of assimilation tradition conflict in the same way because she can't really do either, but also doesn't have the agency to choose between them in the first place.
No, yeah, like it at least sounds like it has a lot more like dynamics going on with like the myth and the culture and the idea of the monkey, or even like the old country, or even like because it speaks a lot more about like less about like like the nostalgia for the old country, but more like this kind of familiar yet comforting warmth that completely contrasts the way that her grandmother like treats her like shit. Like, man. Although I can definitely.
It's definitely like a dense book. Like, it's a socially dense book, and all the characters have really distinctive relations to each other and their social context and their economic context and their ethnic and ideological context, and like some of these are like really like ham-fisted, but like the way it just it crams every possible contradiction of Chinatown in the 1930s into one book is impressive and is like lives up to the potential and the idea of the social novel, I think, in a way that a lot of contemporary sort of literary diversity doesn't really know how to.
One thing I want to say for sure is that Chinatown, like, despite its its very like stereotypical iconography and architecture, what's interesting about it is that spatially it does feel like a space of trauma, because you just get this mishmash of just like your brick like city blocks with your like pagoda style like roof facades and everything, and it's kind of like with a lot with the works that we looked at, like with it's like this like struggle to assimilate as well as trying to like maintain this like what the culture is, but what the culture is like is this like almost like archaic thing, whereas like you go to Hong Kong, like you aren't gonna see no fucking like red lanterns and shit, like unless it's Chinese New Year, like you aren't gonna see no fucking like pagodas or anything, which is funny because Shanghai, or like one of the major Chinese cities, literally has their own Chinatown, selling the brand of what it's like to be in Chinatown.
And I feel like on some level, some of this kind of like reactionary, archaic character of like Diaspora, like, I mean, I wonder how much of that is related to the fact that a lot of this Diaspora is waves of refugees from forms of modernization in the first place, and often from from things like communism, which again, like, I'm not exactly a Maoist, but like between I'm not a CC or like a Dengist CCP guy, but like between the CCP and say Falun Gong, like I'm not super inclined to like endorse Falun Gong, but like,
yeah, like you're right though, because the thing is that like China and Asia to some degree are like one of the most hyper modern like parts of the world, in the sense that they literally industrialized overnight, like almost to a point of like being like in Japan, like we have like Yukio Mishima literally growing up with this hyper modernization after being completely annihilated, and in China like facing wartime and like destruction across the country before like slowly building infrastructure to be able to compete with the globalized world, by compete, just like make a bunch of factories for multinational companies because of cheap labor. But yeah, like that is quite like that is quite something. And actually, like, one thing kind of blurted out a little while ago was that like the heavy-handedness I do feel like is like an unfortunate consequence in the terms of like trying to market these books of like having like gravitas. Like there is immediate gravitas, but the thing is that the heavy-handedness feels almost like it's not even shoehorned. Like I imagine even for Wayson and Choi, at least the heavy-handedness was, well, maybe if it's not warranted, like there's a reason for it. But after that same heavy-handedness kind of defines like what kind of like marketing wants like Chinese literature to be, to have this sort of heavy-handedness to kind of be like a little bit like, oh, it's like the old country, it's like that authoritative old country, like just like to give the novel like a kind of like flavor of feeling Chinese, or at least like trying to fulfill that idea of like how to write a racialized perspective. Like I don't know, am I making sense here? Like
sort of, yeah. I mean, I guess like no, keep going.
Oh no, just like like this
actually, do you want to talk a bit about your own experiences trying to write from like this perspective and like market this to close it out, maybe? And then we should probably like end because it's like 1:35 a.m. But yeah,
really, it is 1:35 a.m. Fuck. No, actually, one thing I want to close out on is that there was one work that I read very early on in university from an Asian American author that was like straight up amazing. If anything, it literally captured the entire arc of what Sheung was doing, but in a much shorter span and in an almost much more heartbreaking span. It's Nam Le's Love and Honor and Pity, where it's basically talking about a guy who's like a Vietnamese American writer who's in an Iowa workshop, and how he's being pushed by like his contemporaries to write about like his experiences in Vietnam or whatever. Like to the point of being like, what's it called? And he's trying to he's struggling with it because he knows it's like really exploitative. And then all of a sudden his his dad comes and visits him, and he has like a very complicated relationship with his dad. And so he tries to like write about his dad's like experiences in the war as like a Viet Cong soldier, and then he finishes it. But then when he finishes it, he realized that his dad was talking to like one of the homeless people on the street, and he has a story in his head, and he burns it in the fire, in a fire barrel in the middle of a lake. And it's like, damn, like in the sense of like there's a much stronger like arc in it in terms of like this idea of how do we even begin to tell the stories of like of the old country, or like or these racialized perspectives, when sometimes like not even that they can't be spoken of, but it's just more like when the trauma is so it's not even not that it's painful, but it's just like it can barely arouse any kind of like worthwhile thing that could even begin to grasp or even fathom what even happened then, or what's even happening now. Like the paragraph, actually the last page is, I was halfway across the bridge when I saw him. I stopped. He was on the riverbank. I couldn't make out the face, but it was he, short and small-headed in my bloated jacket. He stood with the tramp, both of them staring into the blazing gasoline drum. The smoke was thick, particulate. For a second I stopped breathing. I knew with sick certainty what he had done. The ashes, given body by the wind, floated away from me down the river. He patted the man on the shoulder, reached into his back pocket and slipped some money into those large, newly mittened hands. He started up the bank then, and saw me. I was so full of wanting, I thought it would flood my heart. His hands were empty. If I had known then what I knew later, I wouldn't have said the things I did. I wouldn't have told him he didn't understand, for clearly he did. I wouldn't have told him that what he had done was unforgivable, that I wished he had never come, or that he was no father to me. But I hadn't known, and as I waited, feeling the wind change, all I saw was a man coming toward me in a ridiculously oversized jacket, rubbing his black-sooted hands, stepping through the smoke with its flecks and flame-tinged eddies, who had destroyed himself, yet again, in my name. The river was behind him. The wind was full of acid. In the slow float of light I looked away, down at the river. On the brink of freezing, it gleamed in large, bulging blisters, the water where it still moved, was black and braided, and it occurred to me then how it took hours, sometimes days, for the surface of a river to freeze over, to hold in its skin the perfect and crystalline world, and how that world could be shattered by a small stone, dropped like a single syllable.
Wow.
Yeah, and thinking about and this is also another ending that I was thinking of ending this on was, I think part of the reason why I like Johnny To's movies to a degree, like especially something like Trivisa, like, well, he produced Trivisa, but something like Election 2, and even just some of the other ones, is that there's always like a form of transgression within those movies, or like the characters are in this position of transgression. Like, for example, like, you know, the Triads being a criminal organization obviously transgresses like the basically like the public governing system, obviously.
Yeah.
And in a way, being being someone, you know, not of this country, like there's always a there's always a kind of inherent transgression to one's like very existence, because those kinds of people, those people can't just like fit in the same way that others could, or can't or can't just like, you know, for example, just be like you know, basically like go to U of T, like you know, study like finance and work at a trading company or whatever.
Go to like, Western, go out to like go out to one of the 3 bars the entire student body goes to, wearing like the exact same like hoodie and yoga tights, Zoomer uniform, and listen to like
go to the house parties and like just like fuck some bitches or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like yeah, just that like there's like now it's even more prevalent now that just like not even like just like people who aren't like who aren't of this country, but more like just like that liminal space is prevalent between like tons of people, especially people who've grown up on the internet, who don't really see the real world in the way that people would immediately see the real world, as like, you know, like oh you know, we're just talking to some people, but instead it's just like it feels like there's something wrong in the sense of like, one, it's an environment they're not familiar with, and two, like there's almost like a greater malice like felt toward them. Even something like Feed, you know, from so long ago, like one of my favorite scenes from Feed, despite everything, is the part where like the girl's dad gets mad at the guy because he thinks that like he caused her to get extremely sick or whatever, and he's like, and the guy was like, yeah, what is it that I did? What was it that I that you're like mad at me for? And her dad, despite being overeducated, can't answer him.
Yeah.
Like instead he's just constantly viewed as this like walking transgression, in the same way that in Trivisa, like basically the three like basically the three like king of thieves in Hong Kong are kind of slowly being viewed as more and more of like a liability and an annoyance, like with Yip Kai Fun's like you know, splashy robberies of jewelry stores with the AK-47, like sort of retiring into, or quasi-retiring into, trading electronics, because like that stuff doesn't make money anymore. Yeah. Along with just like doing small time robberies that don't pay much, because like obviously like a large like heist would be out of the question. Essentially they're just viewed as being like in the way. Even in Life Without Principle, yeah, like every time like Panther is on screen, like he has to do some very mundane shit just to get money. Like sit in a restaurant for like 2 days straight until the guy's like, I was trying to avoid you for 2 days and you're still here? Here's $5,000, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah.
Or like or like in the recycling truck, he's like getting the cardboard. He's like, oh, here, let me get it. Oh shit, I dropped it. Oh fuck, let me get it. The guy's just like, take this money and get out of here. and then and then all of a sudden and he's just basically being pinballed around by like people who have money essentially, like even like the guy, like, you know, as he gets like stabbed with the ice pick, he's like, no, don't take me to the hospital, take this money and bet on the fact that the Hang Seng index is gonna go down. Joy Theta. And yeah, like but no, yeah, like I think like that's part, and I think that's kind of what I'm trying to gesture with. Actually, I guess what I'll close with is I think the one part that sort of got me to go with some of what I'm trying to do, at least with like a short story collection I'm putting together, was I remember writing something like a short story, like the first short story actually, Nowhere Else But Here, which, well, I mean, I won't mention too much about it, but just that, yeah, I wrote it during a time when I was going through like a somewhat like tumultuous kind of like crush, like to the point that it was like almost like agonizing, and writing through it along with like the stuff that I kind of knew about writing already, putting it together. And then I was kind of like nervous about it because this was like my first like creative writing class, and the professor there, who would go on to kind of be like my mentor, like throughout, like she kind of like picked out like something that was extremely pressing even now. She was like, she said like the beating heart of this story is this liminal space, this space where people are together but not really, where they're in a culture but they're not really in the culture. And I think that was what started sort of pushing me forward and kind of realizing these sort of, as like Subahibi would say, like the edges of our world. How is it that we express the ends of our world, both like the borders of it and how those worlds come to an end? And so that's what I'm hoping to work toward. Or even like towards with what I do.
Really hope you can get Continents Apart published somewhere. I know we've talked about like because you're not trying to publish it with Andata, so it's like we've talked about like the funnier, like the funniest places you could publish it, and like almost all the sort of publishers have like a different outlook towards what they want to publish or what they'd expect of like Asian diaspora lit than that book probably. But I think it would be really cool if you just go with it. Just get the most mainstream publisher you can get. Just put it in Coach House or whatever. Like, see what happens.
Yeah, Coach House, I doubt Coach House would take me on. If Book Hug will take me on, then I doubt Coach House would. If anything, like, I'll mention this at least about one of the things from Continents Apart. Like, you know of this. Like, I did publish something from Continents Apart. I won't name any names about it, but I will say that. Well, at the time, I will admit that I didn't know that much about editing. I was mostly going like, "Oh my gosh, something's gonna get published," so I wasn't able to edit stuff with like a clear concision that I was able to now with one of my boys. And the thing was that afterward, like when I showed it to one of my other boys, he was like, "Yeah, this was not as good as when you showed it to me." And then when I showed it to you, you told me that despite not much changing, there's this awkward subtext where it kind of puts this feeling where it's like, oh, the guy and the girl in the story don't understand each other because they're both not Chinese, and it's like, and it to be a very annoying subtext. And realizing that, I think that was kind of sort of what started getting the ball rolling even more about like kind of my sort of like, oh shit, like I got CIA'd.
I mean, it's not that. It's just sort of. I mean, I don't think there's a particular like. I think it's just sort of people reading what they expected to read into the story, like, and we're trying to focus on what would seem to be like the most sort of easy element to anchor it on, because I mean most of your stories are very, very sort of abstract in terms of what's happening, and like very focused on kind of like the vibe, like, and there's a lot of like stuff that there's not a lot of writing that works like that in particularly not in the kind of like short, like you're gonna read almost in the span that you'd read a clickbait article kind of like online lit journals. Like,
yeah, because actually one thing that, on the topic of anchoring, when I was talking to the editor there, like, at the time, she also said, oh, this is very Wong Kar-wai. So basically...
Okay, yeah, that like, brings us full circle. That'll be a good place to end this, but yeah.
Basically, yeah, there's just this, like, almost, like, pigeonhole specific to, like, literary... you know, Asian diaspora literature, where it's like if you have like a slightly introspective male character with, you know, somewhat floral imagery, like floral visceral imagery, I'll be like, oh, it's Wong Kar-wai, and it's like, man, like I like Wong Kar-wai, like I like his films and all, but like, shit, come on, man.
And it is funnier when that singular stereotype comes from like an Asian editor. It's not even just like, you don't even have the excuse of like, oh, it's like the one Asian movie a white guy's heard of. But like also, I think it does, to be fair, like it does actually fit that story better than it fits, say, Sheung King's. Like that story, yeah.
Man, but it's just like great. Like, does that mean like every single like Asian like diaspora story is just gonna be noted like, oh, it's like Wong Kar-wai, it's like Devils on the Doorstep? Well, I mean, Devils on the Doorstep is actually good, but oh, it's like that one movie, and it's like, really, guy? Like, are we gonna get something where it's like, oh, like this poetry chapbook reminds me of Turning Red? Like, what the fuck? Like,
Wong Kar-wai is not even diaspora. He's, for what it's worth, like actually in Asia. Like, I don't know who the major Asian diaspora filmmakers are. Chloe Zhao.
Yeah, like I straight up don't know who the Asian like diaspora like person is. I mean, I feel like you could probably make a case for like Hong Kong directors because they are living a kind of Asian diaspora in the sense of like,
that's true.
Colonial.
Yeah.
But just like Asian diaspora, like shit, I don't know. I mean, like for writers, like Nam Le for sure. I mean, I guess you can actually like I didn't even get to mention the fact that actually Sheung King's book made me sort of appreciate like Takatsu's like A Forest, Clocks, and Dreams a little bit, because like granted, yeah, it's embarrassing, but there was still sort of like an engagement. And actually it reminds me of another work, because it has the same sort of inner text.
Into the weeds.
But huh?
We're getting into the weeds again. We should probably wrap it up. But
I'll talk more about it like afterward. But no, yeah, how to end this on, it's how to end this on. I don't know, what you think?
I don't know. I feel like you should end it. It's more your thing, but like, but yeah. Well, I mean, I guess we could also just post the note of like, I mean, I wonder whether something like, given this concept of Asian modernities, like something like Sino-futurism is going to sort of shift the vibe around Asian diaspora representation, whether we're going to start dealing with the sort of the reality of contemporary Asia more, even just because it becomes like a cool cyberpunk thing. Haven't really seen that happening yet, but could happen. the geopolitical forces are kind of arrayed against it, but that would make it an interesting and transgressive thing to do. But yeah, that would be a whole other podcast, and we'll keep our eyes open how the representations develop.
Hey, I actually have the perfect way to end this, actually. Let's see, because I know the ending theme will get copyrighted, but just follow
Wait, the
along
Andata
with me.
ending theme? Like the Ryuichi Sakamoto? Is that gonna
Yeah,
get
it got copyrighted last
Oh,
time, so,
fuck! Oh, it did!
yeah,
Oh, God.
So, would you mind terribly just, like, following along with me
Okay.
for the next, like,
Yeah,
hold on.
let's go.
Dun, dun, dun. Find your dreams come true, dun, dun, dun. And I wonder if you know what it means, and I wonder if you know what it means, and I wonder if you know what it means to find your dreams. And I've been waiting on this my whole life. These dreams be waking me up at night, right? You say I think I'm never wrong. You know what? Maybe you're right. I
have not memorized any of this song. I can't, like...
I have the lyrics in front of me. That's the reason.
Okay. Thanks for listening. Good night. See you next time. I can't believe they copyright strike Ryuichi Sakamoto. What?
You want to at least do the last half of I Wonder? Like, pull up the lyrics right now.
Sure, yeah,
like,
okay, 2 seconds.
See,
oh my god, why is Genius moving so slow?
Actually, what do you think is more fitting? The third verse or the last verse?
2 seconds. Let me look. I think wait, which is the second verse? The third is the last verse on Genius.
Oh, okay. Second or third? Yeah. What do you think?
Second maybe.
Oh, second? Yeah. I was thinking that too. All right. Are you ready? Do you want me to count you in?
I mean, I don't even think I remember the flow, so.
All right, just follow along with me.
Yeah.
Just 3, 2. You say he get on your fucking nerves. You hope that he get what he deserves. Word. Do you even remember what the issue is? You're just trying to find where the tissue is. You can still be who you wish you is. It ain't happened yet, and that's what intuition is. When you hop back in the car, drive back to the crib, run back to their arms, the smoke screens, the chokes and the screams. You ever wonder what it all really means?
And I wonder if you know what it means, And I wonder if you know what it means to find your dreams. Okay, that's